common as night and day for people to fight, that we've always fought. And war has always been a part of our existence. What I can say to you and our listeners right now is that simply is not true. That is a false assumption of science. The history books that show the history of the world beginning 5,500 years ago in ancient Sumeria, that's not the history of the whole world. That is the history of one world age cycle. And there was a cycle before that. And the evidence now supports that, as the oral traditions of many indigenous people tell us. And what makes it so interesting, Antonia, is that the archaeology is showing that in these most ancient civilizations, there is no evidence of large-scale warfare. There are no walls built to protect the cities. There's no moats around the cities. There's no evidence of weapons. There are no mass burials. There are no graves with mutilated bodies that you find after a large battle. There are no pictorial records or graphs, pictographs of battlefield scenarios. The earliest ones that we know of are about 4,700 years old in Sumeria, and that the war that we've come to know and accept in our lives as being natural appears to be an anomaly. It is a phenomenon only of this 5,000-year cycle. And with what is known so far, now maybe something will turn up that will change that, but from South America to Turkey, from India to Egypt, the ancient sites show no evidence of large-scale warfare the way that we see it in this cycle. So I think that's interesting, and I think it's important.
Well, Greg, you have no idea what that information means to me right now, because of what I've been teaching for the past, almost a year and a half, and as it was taught to me, is that the human program, the programming of humanity was altered about 5,000 years ago. And that just before this, competition did not exist, violence did not exist, survival did not exist. But it was an agreed upon alteration of the human program, kind of like you're playing a computer game and someone says, hey, you know what, I can make this more intense for you. We all agree, okay, let's give it a shot. And that before that time, we were not that. So,
but this is the key, because our young people are being taught in school today. I've got current mainstream textbooks. The first sentence, the first textbook says, war is who we are. It's as natural as night and day. It's as common as trade or exchange. Mm. And this is where our young people are growing up, thinking that this is who they are and that it is natural. And these are just examples of the new discoveries that are confirmed, and they're validated in peer-reviewed journals, so that it's not wishful thinking and it's not speculation. They're facts. The facts. Now, this is where science comes in. Science is based on what's called the scientific method. And the scientific method is step-by-step process where we determine what's true and what's not in our world. That's how we know it's science. So the scientific method says that when we see something we don't understand, we devise an experiment, we analyze the experiment. If the results of the experiment support the idea, support the theory, then we know the theory is probably correct. If the results don't support the theory, then we go back and we create a new theory. And this is where science is breaking down today. It's not being allowed. Evolution, for example, the facts do not support evolution as applies to humankind, but the new theories are not being allowed to even be considered. The idea that civilization is 5,500 years old, the fact that we're finding, I mean, this is big stuff. If we're looking at civilization near the end of the last ice age, it means either they built these things in the ice, or they were there before the ice formed in some of these areas. And the idea of ice age civilizations, that changes everything about the way we think of ourselves and how long we've been here with technology and tools to build the kinds of structures that we're looking at. I mean, if you can build these things, that means you've got other technologies as well that are implied, the mathematics, the astronomy, to calculate the cycles of time. And all of this changes the way we think about ourselves. So here we are At the end of a 5,125-year cycle, we are poised on the brink of losing many of the things that we cherish in war and disease because of climate and disaster. And we are being asked to make the choices of how to move forward, and we're being asked to do it without having the full, complete toolkit of all the information that helps us to do so in a good way. Mm-hmm. So this I think is why these deep truths are important. And before we take any questions, I want to mention where the term deep truth even comes from. Can I do that right now?
Please do, Greg.
One of the leading physicists of the 20th century, one of the fathers of quantum theory, his name was Niels Bohr.
Yeah.
And in a conversation that Niels Bohr had with Albert Einstein, he used this term. And what he said is, it is the hallmark of any deep truth that its negation is also a deep truth. So in other words, in science, and he was talking about science, in science, we have what are called deep truths that we hold near and dear, that we believe are the foundations of the things we believe. When a new discovery shows us that what we used to think was true is no longer true, then that new discovery becomes the new deep truth. Mm-hmm. And that's precisely what we're seeing here. These are deep truths about our origin, our history, how long we've been here, how we work, what we've known and accomplished in the past. The new discoveries are the new deep truths that are overturning many of those long-held and very cherished beliefs. Mm-hmm. So I want to just kind of lay that foundation before we begin to take any of the questions, or maybe we've answered some of the questions that you have. I don't know.
We have a couple, but I just want to underline. You don't understand how happy I am by what you are showing people.
I can hear your smile.
Oh my goodness! I can barely stay seated. You see me hopping. Thank goodness my seat has an adjustment on it, because what I want people to understand from this is that, this past 5,000-year cycle is not necessarily all that we are. And in creating the new cycle, as you said, in looking to what we now know, what we're now discovering, and even though it's not being allowed out in the mainstream yet, but I think the internet and your work, it will get out there really quickly, and I'll definitely be helping you to do this, is to realize that we have lived differently. Their possibilities are different. I know that, like you said, I know that there was discoveries in, I believe, a part of India where they found, a 5,000-plus-year-old civilization that had running pipes for water and had copper, which implied electricity. So we're talking about, it's not as if we think our generation has discovered everything. We have, but that there's more available. And I think as the work that you're doing in showing that we have lived differently, then that just opens up the possibility of how we can come together, co-create a more oneness reality where we now say, okay, fine, we've done this way for 5,000 plus years. That was one generation. This new age of how we want to live and create. How do we want to do it now? And it doesn't have to be based on, as we know right now, the banking system is corrupt and falling apart. The legal system is, all this, I believe all these things, we've had questions about coming in about, how about the corrupt legal system?
Battery low.
As the ancient cultures had prophesied, we are being shown how our way of life is not sustainable. And
it's not sustainable, but the problem is, unless these ideas are embraced, the choices that we're making to address the crises of today are going to be based on the old ideas. And the irony, as we approach this 2012 window of time, is that the greatest threats to our existence are the threats that we have total control over. It's less about earth changes. We've survived those in the past. But the big things like war, for example, we are poised on the brink of global war right now, and there are a couple of hot spots that could put us right over that brink sometime this year, 2011, is a big year when the decisions are being made. If we base our decisions of when to go to war, when to take a life, when to preserve a life, when to help, and how to help, if we base those on obsolete ideas, scientific ideas, for example, survival of the fittest, then we open ourselves up to the mistakes that we've seen in the past. But our ancestors are very clear. The native traditions of Mesoamerica, so the American desert Southwest down through Central America, Mexico, South America, they identify at least 4 world ages that existed before this one. We're living the 5th and about to end the 5th, moving into the 6th world age. And each world age, they talk to us about the people and of the time and how that world age ended. There was one world age that ended when fire swept the earth, another one when wind swept the earth, another one when ice covered the earth, and another one when the ice melted and water covered the earth, that we now take as, interpret as the Great Flood that so many civilizations talk about, or cultures talk about. So I think there's a growing body of evidence that we've been here much longer than we've been led to believe, that we've lived differently, and that our truest nature is very different from what we've been led to believe, and that as our beliefs lead to the crises, excuse me, that we're seeing now, the memory and our willingness to embrace what the discoveries are showing us about ourselves and our past, that open the door to the new possibilities of the new world that's emerging. And there is a new world that's emerging, and I'm very optimistic about the new world that is coming down the line, and I'm also a realist, and we've got a little bottleneck of a couple of years that we've got to squeeze through without having the wars that have been seen and visualized and prophesized in so many traditions. And I believe that we don't have to have the economic breakdown that so many are forecasting as well, because all of those things are completely under our control. But unless we think of ourselves differently, we're going to make the choices that play in to the depths of our darkest fate rather than the light of our greatest destiny. And I think that's the choice that we're all being asked to make right now.
Absolutely. It's time to wake up and work. Absolutely. So, Greg, let's move to some questions.
All right.
And they're pouring in.
I bet.
And I know. Which means that we have to have you back again soon, of course. But we have Pauline in Tokyo, and she says that she has a question for you. She says that although I don't live near the center of the recent disaster where survivors so courageously and with hope and dignity rethink and replan their lives, the aftershocks we feel continue, and the warnings and the nuclear power plant crisis continues. It is very stressful. I wonder if you have any comments. I'm a great fan of yours. Love, Pauline.
We could do a whole evening on precisely what Pauline has said. The first comment I'm going to say is, Pauline, myself, I know hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. Our hearts go out to you. And I don't know if this is a time for the kind of encouragement or not, but I know that there are plans on the table for the rebuilding of of entire cities in northern Japan based on many of the concepts that we're talking now that would be models for the rest of the world to see what's possible when we start from nothing and what can be built from that. So it doesn't mitigate the hurt and the suffering that is being experienced right now, but it also opens the door to a great ray of light of what is possible from that degree of suffering, in that many people from all over the world are putting the plans together. This is moving very quickly of actually rebuilding new, green, sustainable communities and cities from the rubble of what is left right now as a model of all that's possible for all of us as we enter this new world age. So I just want you to know that our prayers, our thoughts, and our minds are with you all in looking down the road at the future as well as how to get through this moment.
Thank you for that, Greg. Absolutely. Our prayer and our thoughts are absolutely with Pauline. She's been sending me constant emails and giving me updates, and it's just incredible. The spirit, the dignity, the coming together of the people of Japan and how they've, how they're showing the world that, there's no looting, there's no fighting, there's nothing. There's just coming together to help each other. And what an incredible example to show the world.
It is an example, and also because it's happening in Japan now, what happened in Japan can happen anywhere in the world. If it can happen anywhere, it can happen everywhere. And those who are not directly affected right now are blessed by not being affected, but they're also being given the gift of a window of time to learn from this disaster, a magnitude of which nobody could have been prepared for. Nobody's expecting anything like this, and it continues. So I think this is the key, that although many of our listeners aren't living the experience directly, we're all learning from that experience in the way that the Japanese are modeling what's possible as they work together to heal from what's happened to them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Then we have another question sort of writing on the Japan situation right now from Pamela in Portland, and she's saying, because of what's happening in Fukushima and how that is impacting the world with the radiation poisoning and the iodine now being found all over the world, what advice do you have for protecting ourselves against radiation?
That's more than I could do justice to in this conversation. So what I'm going to say is it is frightening, it is scary, and it's something we all need to be aware of. I don't know how old the person is that just sent this, but most of us, I would imagine, listening to this program, were exposed to much higher levels of radiation if we lived in the United States of America during the 60s and parts of the 50s, when our own country was doing atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons in Nevada. And I was living in Missouri at the time, and I remember we had problems with radiation falling on the grass and the milk being radioactive in northern Missouri, Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas. So it is frightening at any time. It's something we all need to be aware of. And I think it's also important to keep it in perspective. And the amounts right now, if the authorities are being honest with us, those amounts, it's telling us that the radiation is on the move, and it's also telling us it's low level at this point. So I don't think it's something that I don't want people freaking out over it, but we definitely need to be aware of it. What the holistic practitioners have told us is that many Japanese, we learned a lot from the Japanese in World War II, and many people who were very near ground zero had minimal effects, and they traced it all back to the fact that they were eating seaweed. And it's not the artificially colored seaweed that you find in a lot of restaurants. It's the natural colored seaweeds that have the kind of iodine that our body can use. You don't want to go out and buy a bunch of iodine and pump it into your body. There are forms of iodine that our cells can uptake in a useful, meaningful, and healthy way. And that seaweed and miso soup were both two elements that they found that were in common to the doctors and the medical people who were working very close to ground zero and didn't experience the effects. So I think nature gives us ways to I'm not going to say protect us, I'm going to say to give us the strength and the way to heal our bodies in the presence of whatever the world shows us if we honor those principles and what it is our body needs.
I think nature always provides a way that we can harmonize with whatever it is that we need to deal with, as long as we're willing and open to nature's assistance.
I agree, and I think for people that are really concerned, I invite them to really do some research, because there's conflicting data. The media, I was just on tour this last week. I don't watch TV at home. I was watching in my hotel room on the road, and different stations and different media outlets gave completely different stories and different readings. And I left the hotel feeling confused. I said, what are we supposed to believe?
Of course.
So I think if it is of concern, it's important to research it through the websites, the scientific and technical websites, rather than what a lot of the media is picking up and projecting right now.
Yep, and of course the media is going to sensationalize and work on that because it creates a good story. So maybe look more to scientific journals of information as opposed to what's in the news.
It is. I'm not down on the media. What happens is a lot of times a reporter, they'll hear something and it's given to them as fact, and they want to get the story out quickly and they share it, and then 30 minutes later they find their data wasn't wrong, but they already shared it. So I'm not blaming anyone, but I'm saying that if we are concerned, then it's our responsibility to look into the data for ourselves and go to reliable technical and scientific sources, I think, more than just the media that often is sensationalist or just in a hurry to get something out to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great advice. Great. Greg, I'm going to combine two questions here, one from Carl and one from Carl here in Whitby, and one from Rosemary in Pennsylvania, because Rosemary is asking about the magnetic pole shift. And we talked about this last time when you said, no, there shouldn't be a big pole shift happening. But these two questions kind of come together.
Okay.
Rosemary is wondering about the pole shift, and Carl is saying, do you believe that we have bigger and more Earth crises coming, and what can we do to lessen, prepare, and help? So they're kind of both addressing Earth changes.
Right. What I was talking about magnetic reversals back in the late 1980s, based on what we knew then, and now I'm sharing what I know about it right now. So I'm updating what we know. The ice cores in Antarctica that were taken in 1999 allow us to go back 450,000 years into the history of the Earth. And there are other ways that we can go back even further. The magnetic poles reversed 14 times in the last 4.5 million years. The last confirmed reversal was 780,000 years ago. All of these reversals have something in common, and that is that before the poles can reverse, they have to weaken to a point. It's called a threshold. They have to weaken to a minimum threshold. Never in 4.5 million years have the poles reversed until they reach this weakened threshold. And the reason I'm saying that is because the magnetic strength of the Earth, the intensity right now, is so far above that threshold. And this 2012 window of time is just around the corner. That the possibility of that field becoming so weak in less than 2 years is very unlikely, unless something totally bizarre happens, like an asteroid hits the Earth, or something like that. That could change everything. But what I'm saying is the scientific data right now does not support a reversal of the Earth's magnetic poles happening anytime before or immediately after 2012. So of all the things to be concerned about, we can put that one at the bottom of the list and take a sigh of relief. And that's what the science and what the data is actually showing us right now. As far as the earthquakes, what happens historically, and I think we're actually seeing this, is that when the plates are on the move, rarely is there a single large event. And the Pacific, we have what's called the Pacific Ring of Fire. Our listeners probably know about that. And it's a ring of a fault zone that travels from Alaska down to the Baja on North America and through Japan and the islands in the Pacific. And the reason I'm saying that is because it's not unusual to see when there's a big seismic event on one side that it triggers a lot of movement on the other side. Sometimes it can come as one big jolt, or sometimes it can come as a lot of small earthquakes on the other side. So I would not be surprised to see more seismic activity because this one big one put that into motion. And we've already seen what they're calling aftershocks, or what we call big earthquakes. I mean, I'm amazed. 7.2 aftershock. That's a big earthquake. Mm-hmm. So I think realistically and honestly, it's probably not over for the Pacific Ring of Fire. The likelihood of seeing another one at 9.0, I think, is pretty unlikely right now, because the big slip, big motion that all of that energy was building up, and now that big moment has happened. And now the rest of the plates are settling in to adjust to that big quake, and I expect you'll see it throughout that Pacific Ring of Fire.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yes.
That was probably a long answer to a short question.
No, it's a very good answer to a question, especially being a geologist. You definitely know what you're speaking about.
Well, I want to ask you. We started a few minutes late. Are you set up to go over the top of the hour a little bit, so
Absolutely.
we can honor our time frame here?
If you have time to do that, I'm sure
I'm going to make time to do it because I know we started maybe the 10 after the hour or something,
mm-hmm.
and I want to honor our time and our listeners.
Good. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And a question coming in from Heather in Victoria, BC. She's asking, is it photon energies that are awakening the codes within us?
I could not even begin to answer that question. It hasn't been anything that I am aware of or that I've been focused on. Photon energy, photon is light. Photons are light, and we are surrounded by photon energy. And my sense is, I think I know where the question's coming from. It's not an area of my expertise. And I'm very comfortable saying I don't know when I don't know. But my sense is there was a talk about something about a photon belt that a lot of us heard about many years ago. And I heard about it as well. And I have to tell you, in all honesty, while there was a lot written about it in magazines and the internet, I could never find a credible source confirming that such a belt actually exists. So I can't comment on from a factual perspective. But what I will say is whether it's a photon belt or whatever it is we want to call it, we are definitely in an era when there is an awakening and people are becoming more aware of their relationship to themselves and the earth. And I think it's the changes that are happening in the world that are triggering that awakening. The world changes and people say, what's going on? And what's happening? And why would something happening in one place affect me somewhere else? And the only way to answer that is to understand our relationship to the earth and our relationship to one another. And I think that is a big trigger for the awakening. So that's probably the best I could do on that answer right now.
Thank you. Yes. Another question coming in from Carl, and he asks, do you believe we are getting help from other dimensions in this great shift? And how can we best co-create together?
Again, the only way I could answer that is to speculate. I don't know any facts about any help from and I want to be responsible here. I don't want to just shoot off a bunch of answers that are guesses. There's no science that supports the fact that we're getting help from any higher dimensions. My sense is, and my personal experience working with shamans and indigenous people throughout the world, many cultures, is they tell us that we exist on many dimensions, not just this third dimension. And if we are getting help from other dimensions, it may be help from ourselves. It's us on the other levels that are helping ourselves, our higher selves communicating with the experience that we're having here to give us a perspective and a point of reference and a framework that helps us through. But ultimately, I think it's us that are going to make or break this cycle. We must awaken to our own power. We must awaken to our relationship to the earth and to one another and to the higher forces, higher dimensions. And I think it's the intensity of the experience that is triggering that awakening, ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what I have always said is, as you have stated, it's about us coming together as humanity and working together to create the next level of existence that any beings that may be here to assist, and even in the indigenous cultures when we talk about
battery low,
to bring the answers. We are the ones to find our own answers. They can maybe guide us.
Guide us, yeah.
But
well,
it really is up. This is our experience. It's up to us to co-create it in a way that we can live in harmony.
And I think what's so interesting is that I have not studied every indigenous tradition in the world. Every indigenous tradition in the world that I have studied, every one of them has told us that we're nearing the close of a great cycle. They use different language to say it, but they all say that we're close to the end of this cycle, the beginning of the next. Not one of them says it's the end of the world, but every one of them says they cannot tell and predict and prophesize how this little window, this bottleneck of time turns out. They give possibilities. They're ancient prophets or their remote viewers or their seers. When they looked from their time in the past into our future, they all saw two very different possibilities. One is very dark, a very dark possibility of war and greed and suffering, and one of a very beautiful possibility of peace and cooperation and a renewed relationship with the earth. But they all say that they cannot tell us how this time comes out because we're the wild card. It's up to us to make the choice, and nobody knows how we will choose. But I'll also say that we're making that choice right now. The little things we do, our little choices in life, what seem to us like little choices, actually are the big collective answer to our time in history. So we're making the choice right now, right this minute, just through the way we live our lives.
Absolutely, we are. And I also know that I spent some time back in September with some Kogi Mamus, and the Mamus are their shaman. And every indigenous people also tells us, as the Kogi did, they say, do not look to our ways. Remember yours. And the Kogi, I know, stepped out, even though they've been in seclusion for thousands of years, but to remind us, same thing, that right now the earth is at a pivotal point in time that we need to come together and unite and honor each other, honor the world, honor the earth, honor each other. And they also say, do not look to our ways. Our ways are our ways. Find your own. Remember who you are. And I think that whole theme comes through. And I think, as we talked about in fractal time, about the cycle of time coming to a point in time, as we now see, we've talked about before about how the earth is shifting on this trajectory that we're on. It's all of this is coming up to this pinnacle of where humanity now can create. And I think we are. Like you, I am very positive and I am optimistic that more people are waking up and saying, wait a minute, I don't need to live my life in competition. I don't need to always be buying these things. Being happy doesn't mean I have to have more stuff, because if I have more stuff, then someone had to tear down a tree,
right?
Put a child to work in a factory or some such thing. I think we're becoming more and more aware. And definitely things like the internet and the work you're doing is showing people, wait a minute here, we don't have all the information. Let's reassess and let's look at where we're going and where do we want to choose to go.
Well, I think everything you're saying is the key. And, to a large part, I mean, the listeners on this program, there are what I would call the choir. The choir that already knows what we're talking about, is already on board with this message. And much of the media that I do we are speaking to people that are already embraced these ideas, and that's good. And if we're going to tip the scales of life and balance in our favor, we've got to reach way beyond the choir to the mainstream, to people who are making the choices, voting the policies, enacting the legislation that is forming so much of the framework for the way we live our lives. And I'm encouraged by what I've seen, both publicly and behind the scenes. There are changes that are happening there. But this is where I think it's important to stay with the facts and stay with, everyone learns differently. But everyone, the people I've met, I think they're all working for a better world. And everyone's learned different ways to go about doing it. But what I find interesting is many of the leaders that for corporations, in politics, we've had the opportunity to spend some time with, that believed they knew where we're going and what was happening. They all say that something is very, very different than what they expected. And they come to programs, like the seminars that we'll be doing in Toronto. They come to those programs because they want to know, just like everybody else wants to know, what's happening and what's going on. And the same science that tells us that this change is here is also telling us that when it comes to the human heart, there is no them and us, there's we. The magnetic field that links all life, every blade of grass, every hamster, every goldfish, every CEO of every corporation and every leader of every nation, they are linked in the same magnetic field that links my heart to your heart, to all of our listeners right now. And this is where I think the spiritual rubber really meets the road of our lives, because it tells us that it's less about the words that we use and more about how we live our lives, what we do, what we claim in our hearts. When we create coherence between our heart and our brain, when we can feel the feelings of appreciation, gratitude, care, compassion, and Japan's giving us a great opportunity to do that. We can do those things for ourselves. What we do is we feed that coherence into the very field of the earth that sustains all life. And there is no them and us. All the leaders are connected to that field. And I'm just going to say it's really hard to declare war on another country when your heart is in a field of coherence. I've seen this work in the corporate boardroom. I've seen it work in communities. We've seen it work on a national level in moments of time like 9/11. Right after 9/11, there was an outpouring of heart-based emotion and tremendous coherence throughout the world. Nobody was going to war then. And it only lasted for a few days, unfortunately. But we know it's possible. So all of these things, I think, science is telling us that we're more than we've been led to believe. We've been here longer, that we are cooperative, peaceful beings by nature. And science is also telling us that what we create in our individual hearts is what fuels the collective field that links all hearts, and that's the place where the decisions are made. So that's why every moment of every day and the little choices that we make in our living rooms are actually becoming the big choices that tip the scales of balance for our time in history. And I think that's the piece that it's important to bear in mind for all of us.
Absolutely, and I'm nodding, completely and absolutely, completely. Greg, there's one last question that just sort of ties into exactly what you said, but I want to make sure that Harry sent it in realizes that we're answering it. And his question was, based on watching one of your videos on DNA, his question was, if he sent his DNA to Japan, along with 10,000 other people via, for example, by licking an envelope, that if all the letters go to the same town, and that if we concentrate on that area sending love and energy, and that since our DNA would react to the same there as it would here, would that bring about a change? And that kind of answers that. You answered that question with the heart coherence one, but I just want to make sure that Harry knows that we have.
Yeah, that's nobody's ever asked that question, and I love where it's coming from. Okay, so I'll just quickly, as a scientist, I'll tell you the DNA on the sticky part of the envelope probably wouldn't live once the envelope dries, so it probably wouldn't have the effect. On the one hand, on the other hand, what the science now is telling us is that because we are quantum beings, that we don't have to be in the place where the problem is to have an effect. And that's why remote prayer, remote healing, remote Reiki works the way it works. You can be in one part of this earth, and you don't have to send this experience anywhere. When we claim it for ourselves through what is now called quantum entanglement, we know that everyone is affected to some degree by what happens in one place. And when many people are creating the same experience, that quantum effect is amplified. We've seen this in the medicineless healing in the hospitals in Japan, where 3 practitioners feel a feeling in their bodies, and a woman who has a cancerous tumor responds in her body in the same room, but they never touch her. What they do is they give thanks of gratitude and appreciation.
Battery low.
Trained to do in their hearts, and they create the field of healing, and her body resonates. It responds to that field of healing, but they never touch her physically. And in that way, the same thing has been documented with people who have sent their DNA to other parts of the world. People who live in Southern California send living tissue specimens 400 miles away to Phoenix, Arizona. And the DNA, the tissue is hooked up to monitors. And when the people in Phoenix when they feel, or in LA, when they feel the feelings of emotion, their DNA 400 miles away responds to it. So the only way that could happen is for this quantum field to carry those experiences, and that it tells us that we're linked in many ways. And for me, it all comes back to the significance of every moment of every day of our lives. We don't have to go out and go to the UN and make a big proclamation to change the world. We are all parts of that change just by the way, the choices we make at the grocery store, and our family, at the dinner table. It's walking our talk, how we choose to live our lives every moment of every day. And a lot of people don't like to hear that. They want to think it's something bigger, but I think it's just that simple. I think it's when we live in our lives what we claim in our hearts. That's how we individually contribute to the collective tipping of the scale of life and balance. And I think now is a really good time to do that.
Absolutely. Well, Greg, those are very powerful words to end on. And absolutely, it's always the simple things in life that make the biggest differences, and that can affect the world. I want to remind our listeners that you are speaking here in Toronto at the I Can Do It conference, which is May 13th to the 15th. Specifically, you are keynoting on Sunday, May 15th, 8:30 a.m. to 10 p.m. Those of you that have not yet purchased tickets, I do urge you to. I know that speaking to my friends at Hay House, they're pretty much sold out. So just beneath where you're listening to this on the webcast, there's a little button that if you click on that, it'll take you right into the Hay House site, and do go ahead and get your tickets. I'm also very happy to hear that Deep Truth is now available on Amazon. So I absolutely encourage you to go up to the Amazon site and order the book right away. I didn't know. I can't wait to get my hands on my copy. And Greg, once again, it's been an absolute delight and privilege, and thank you for this evening. I look forward to seeing you here in Toronto.
I look forward to that as well. Be sure, please come say hello, and I want to thank you again for just for your vision to make these broadcasts possible, and your dedication to following through with them. I know sometimes it'd be easier not to, and there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that we don't know about. So I want to thank you and all the people that make this possible, and look forward to seeing all of our friends in Toronto. And I look forward to the next time. I don't have to have a new book to do the program, so I look forward to the next time, okay?
I'm sure we can find plenty of material in your current book to have another discussion on. In fact, I'm having questions about, I already have people sending questions asking, when can you put it into a steady format?
Well, there's a whole program we could do on that then.
There you go.
Okay.
Well, Greg, once again, absolute pleasure having you with us. All of our listeners, thank you for being with us tonight. This has been Antonia Hoggins of the Masterpiece Live Conference Call Network, and Greg Bradon, author of the newly released Deep Truth, Igniting the Memory of Our Journey, History, Destiny, and Fate. Once again, to all of you all over the world, our love goes out to you. Namaste and peace. Good evening, everyone.
And you can't throw the baby out with the... What? It's just like, okay, that's the Democrats. Well, why do they need a political voice? Well, to keep the hierarchy from degenerating into rigid tyranny. It's part of the political discussion. But now the problem is this is the problem with the left, is that, well, what's the hierarchy? It's a tyrannical patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. It's partly corrupt, like every system. But it's less corrupt than most systems, and there's a lot of elements of it that are devoted towards self-improvement and self-monitoring. You have to be a little nuanced and subtle about these sorts of things. And you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the leftist rhetoric has got so intense that the idea is, and people believe this, well, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Everything is getting worse in all possible ways, and there's systemic racism everywhere, and it's utterly unfair, and it should be torn down and rebuilt. It's like, no. It's actually functioning unbelievably well, even though it still has its problems. You know, and there's a big difference between saying there's systemic racism everywhere And the reason that there isn't perfectly equal outcomes is because of prejudice. And saying, no, look, the system is functioning, let's say at 75%. It's doing all right. It's got some problems, including systemic prejudice, which hopefully will work themselves out across time and which show every bit of evidence of doing so. And so we don't need a radical solution. And one of the things I've started to do with my Twitter account is to tweet out good, non-naive news. Because one of the things that's happening in the world, and there's been half a dozen books on this or more written in the last 5 years by credible people, is that the distribution of the idea of individual sovereignty and property rights and free market economies, etc., out into the rest of the world is making the non-Western world, is making the non-Western world rich really, really, really fast. So between 2000 and 2012, the rate of absolute poverty in the world fell by half. It was the fastest period of economic development in human history. We beat the optimistic UN target by 3 years. Staggering. The rates of child mortality in Africa are now lower than they were in Europe in 1950. The fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. Millions of people a month are getting access to this incredible technology that's embodied in cell phones, right? People have access to fresh water like they've never had access before. The kids are getting immunized at a rate that's unprecedented, and yet we have this idea that's become rampant in the West that there's something ultimately corrupt about the patriarchal tyranny and that it has to be dismantled right down to its core. And a lot of that's being taught by the activist disciplines in universities, and I just don't get it. It's not acceptable.
So they see these hierarchies, and their proposal to level everything off and to take away the insane power at the very top is equality of outcome. This unproven in terms of it's never been done successfully to a utopian.
Right. Well, I also don't even think you can do it in principle, because if you accept the proposition, the propositions I laid out, which is you have to pursue things of value, and if you pursue things of value in a social space, so you do it cooperatively and competitively, you do it with other people, then you're going to produce differential outcome because people will be differently good at it.
Yes.
Well, it's like, okay, you don't believe that? It's like, okay, do you listen to random selections of music online? Or do you do what everyone else does? You go for the 0.1% of songwriters, and you only listen to them. You only listen to you only read the productions of 0.1% of writers. You only listen to the podcasts of 0.1% of podcast broadcasters. Right? When you watch sports on TV, you only watch the athletic contributions of 0.1% of athletes. So, where's the equality exactly? Where's that in your life? You people who are pushing for equality of outcome. You manifest that in anything you do? You don't. You're unbelievably selective, just like everyone else. And the reason you're selective is because there are things that are happening that need to happen or that are entertaining and interesting, and you want the best in all of those realms. That's how it works. And there is a best. That's the other thing that's so painful. And that actually is painful. Here's a problem of dispossession, a real problem. One way to not do very well in any hierarchy is to have a low IQ. And so IQ is normally distributed. And if you have an IQ of less than 85, it's hard for you to read well enough to follow instructions. That's about 10% of the population, might even be higher than that. Okay, so given that lack, how are you going to compete? And the answer is, you're not. Because low IQ is a good predictor of poverty. Now they spiral because if you're cognitively if you're less cognitively gifted, then and you have children, they're going to be in a less enriched environment. These things spiral, but you still have the essential problem. That's the essential problem of the dispossessed. It's like hierarchies are complex tools to attain necessary goals, but they dispossess people. What do we do with the people that they dispossess? The answer is, we don't know. So we have to talk about it constantly to figure out how to solve it, because it's an ongoing problem that transforms, and that's the reason that political dialogue is necessary. And then the danger is that the political dialogue will polarize into the radical left, no hierarchies whatsoever, or the radical right. Our hierarchy is 100% right at all costs. And so we have the eternal problem, and those are the two poles that we have to negotiate between.
It's interesting because the accusation has always been that what the left is trying to do with this equality of outcome thing is sort of an infantilization of the populace, right? And the best example of that is sports. When you look at sports, clearly the best people win, right? The fastest runners win the race. The people that have the best strategy win the game. The that's a weird word, infantilization, I never get it right, but of that is what we do with children, where you get participation trophies and no one wins. You know, when my daughter was 3 years old, she was in soccer, and they didn't keep score, but everyone knew. Everyone knew these kids scored, and they didn't. At the end of the game, they didn't announce a winner. There was
you can't have a soccer game without keeping score. Yeah, it's not a soccer game anymore. It's something else.
But the score was kept.
Of course.
It just wasn't discussed.
Well, of course.
It was the strangest thing. But this is to treat these little kids, because they couldn't handle it. Yeah. You know, she cried when the other team scored. I'm like, it feels bad when they score, so it feels good when you score. It's very difficult to say that to a 3-year-old.
Right.
So is she going to run hills? Is she going to practice drills so that she feels that good feeling more? And then there's a point where that becomes too far. There's a point where you become an obsessive over-winner, right? And this is the people that want to crush their enemies. Then you become Conan the Barbarian. Yeah. This is the far end of it. Okay, and this is what the left is terrified of, right? Yeah. The idea of the left is the demure, the soft, the people that are kinder and gentler. The idea of the right is the conqueror, the people that, you know, they work hard, play hard, go kick ass, go America, that kind of shit. And so these are the type of people that are going to be crueler. They're going to do what it takes to win. And the people that you would consider that would like equality of outcome are the people that are trying to slow that down. Does this make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's how it lays itself out temperamentally, too.
Psychologically. Yes. This is the motivation for all this.
Yes. And it's, well, and the radical left is compassion gone mad, although it's also envy. Let's not forget about that. Because, envy. Well, absolutely. Yes. I mean, one reason to stand up for the dispossessed is because you're empathetic. You know, and empathy is not an automatic good. This is something we make a big mistake about. We think, well, I'm feeling sorry for you, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, I might be feeling too sorry for you. I might not be demanding enough of you. So, and that's the terrible devouring mother, you know, from a psychoanalytic perspective. Yes. Oh, everything you do, dear, is okay. It's like, no, it's not. Right. So one of the things that Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, he was very interested in figuring out a way out of this, and it's very much relevant to your concept, your talk about athletics. Okay, so imagine this. Because this is also something that points the way to a proper morality, which was actually something that Jean Piaget was very concerned about. He wanted to reconcile the distinction between religion and science. That's actually what drove him. Even though people don't know that, he was arguably the world's greatest developmental psychologist. So here's the idea. You know how you tell your kid to be a good sport? You say, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game. Okay, so I've been unpacking that in my lectures because it's really, really complicated. It's like you tell your kid that and they look at you and they think, well, what do you mean by that? Aren't I supposed to try to win? It's a soccer game. I'm supposed to win. And you say, well, yeah, you're supposed to win, but it doesn't matter whether you win or lose. It matters how you play the game. You know that that's right, but you don't know how to explain it to your kid. You say, well, you want to be a good sport. Okay, so imagine this. This is how it works. And this is crucially important. So, first of all, life is not a game. Even a game is not a game. Because a game is, most of the time, a game is the beginning of a series of games. So let's say that you're on a soccer team. Well, there's winning the game, but the game isn't the issue. The game is the whole series of games. So maybe the game is winning the championship. And winning the championship and winning a game are not the same thing. And the reason for that is, well, maybe if you want to win a game, the best thing to do is to let your star player make all the moves. But if you want to win a championship, maybe the best thing is for your star player to do everything he or she possibly can to develop all the other team members. That's a different strategy. And the reason it's different is because it iterates across time. Okay, so I'll tell you a quick story. So when my kid was playing hockey, when he was about 12 or so, he was in the championship game, just at a local arena, you know. And it was really fun to watch. The teams were pretty equal, which is something that you want, so that everybody can expand their skills while they're playing. And it was like 5 seconds to the end of the game, and the other team made a breakaway and came down. And the guy came down the ice and scored. It was a beautiful goal, and it was 4-3, and that was the end of it, right? And on my kid's team, there was the kid who was the star, and he was a pretty good hockey player. He came off the ice, and he was very annoyed about what had happened. He smashed his stick on the cement and was complaining about the refereeing and acting as if he'd been robbed. And his father came up, and instead of saying, "Get your act together, kid, that's no way to display yourself after a loss," he said, "Oh yeah, man, you were robbed, that the referees didn't ref right, and you played the best, and you should have won." And I thought, you absolute son of a bitch. You're ruining your son. And then the question is why? Because his son was the star and was trying to win. Why was he ruining his son? Well, you're trying to train your son not to win the game. You're trying to train your son to win the championship. And so that's a series of games. But then life isn't the championship. Life is a whole bunch of championships. It's a whole sequence of them. And so what you're actually trying to train your son to do is to be a contender in the entire series. And the way you do that is by helping him develop his character. And the character is actually the strategy that would enable him to win the largest number of games across the largest possible span of time. And one way you do that if you're a kid is like, well, what do you want to do with your kid? You don't want to teach him to win. You want to teach him to play well with others. And that's to be reciprocal. So that means to try to win, but also to pay attention to developing the other people around him, and not to put winning the game above everything at all times. So then he's fun to play with. And this is absolutely crucial. You can help your kid become fun to play with between the ages of 2 and the age of 4. If your kid is fun to play with, then what happens? Kids line up to play with him. And adults line up to teach him. And if kids line up to play with him, then he'll have friends his whole life. And he'll be socialized, and he'll be invited to many games, some of which he'll win, all of which he'll be able to participate in. And if he's fun to play with, then adults will teach him things, and then he wins at life. And so when you say to your kid, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game, what you're saying is, don't forget, kid, that what you're trying to do here is to do well at life. And you need to practice the strategies that enable you to do well at life while you're in any specific game. And you never want to compromise your ability to do well at life for the sake of winning a single game. And there's a deep ethic in that, and it's the ethic of reciprocity in games. Part of the reason that we're so obsessed with sports is because we like to see that dramatized, like the person we really admire as an athlete isn't only the person who wins. We don't like the narcissistic winners. They're winners, and that's a plus. But if they're narcissistic, they're not good team players. They're only out for themselves. Then we think, well, you're a winner in the narrow sense, but your character is suspect. You're no role model, even though you're a winner. And it's because we're looking for something deeper. We're looking for the manifestation of character that allows you to win across the set of possible games. And that's a real thing. That's a real ethic. It's a fundamental ethic.
I think what you're pointing out that's very important is we're searching for the person who's got it all nailed. Someone who tries their hardest but is also honest enough about
feel as if the miracles have already happened without judgment, without ego. And that's hard for the Western mind. So first we must do this, to feel as if our prayers have already been answered without judgment, without ego. Okay, now, we're going to switch gears. We're going to go to a different monastery. This is a monastery in Egypt, in the mountains of Egypt. By the way, I saw Italian mountains for the first time yesterday with beautiful new snow. Did you see them? Yes. Beautiful new snow yesterday? Very beautiful, very beautiful. Thank you, Silvana. This is the mountains of Egypt. And this is interesting because when you think of Egypt, you don't think of mountains. You think of desert and ocean, sea. But this is in the mountains of Egypt. There is a very old monastery. This monastery is at the very base of Mount Sinai of Exodus, the book of Exodus. This is called St. Catherine's Monastery. Have you been to St. Catherine's Monastery? Some of you have seen it? Okay, then you know what you're going to see here. On the outside, this monastery looks very old. This is a Coptic Christian monastery. The monks are Coptic Christians. They wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning and begin their prayers. They go to sleep when the sun goes down. They have no electricity that they use. The electricity is there, but they don't use it. They burn oil for their light. They bake their bread in the sun. They pump their water from the wells every morning. It looks very primitive on the outside. Wait until you see the inside of this monastery. Would you like to see the inside? Okay, I was very surprised when we saw this. We walked, this is in the middle of the desert, nowhere in the desert. Look at the inside of this monastery. The first time I saw this in the middle of the desert, I thought, how could they do that? And then I remembered the monastery has been there 1,500 years. They've had 1,500 years to decorate. So it's good. All right, it was in this monastery. I know that there is a hidden library in this monastery. Beautiful library. Part of it is open to the public, part of it is hidden. However, before you get to the monastery or to the library, you have to go past these rooms. Every monk who has ever lived in the monastery, their body remains in the monastery, so the energy of the monastery stays in one place. So for 1,500 years, every body of every monk that has died here, when the monk dies, they take the leg bones and put them in one room. They take the skulls and put that in another room. They take the rib cage and put it in another room. And they label them all so they can tell us where Brother John from 1604, where his skull is. They keep everything. They keep everything in this monastery, including the records of the ancient wisdom. So we ask the question, is there a secret library? And at first they said no, because they did not want us to see these rooms. The only way to get to the library is to walk past these rooms. We convinced them that we would like to see this library. They took us past these rooms, and we ended up in a room that looks like this. Now, can you see this door right here, the arch? Do you see the archway? And do you see this little window right here? There's a little window that's covered with brown paper. And this abbot right here, here's the abbot of the monastery. He's the man in the very back. I apologize, you can't see my pointer, but he's the man in the very center. I asked this abbot, can we look inside that room? And he said, no, it's not possible. And I said, please, and he said, we cannot. And I said, we've come a long way just to see this place. He said, okay. But he said, no photograph. No photograph. So I do not have a photograph. I want to tell you what's in this room. Now, this is an old monastery. They bake their bread in the sun. They use oil for the lamps. They have no electricity that they use. And we walked into that room, and all of a sudden, there is a room full of computers. Apple computer, Macintosh computer, IBM computer, scanners, satellite boxes. And I said, what are you doing in this room? And the monk became very serious. He said, we have been in this monastery 1,500 years. And we've been very fortunate. because we have never been overrun by a foreign army. We've never been taken over. He said, but we think that this monastery will be destroyed in our lifetime. We think something will happen, that there will be a war in this part of the world, and this monastery will be destroyed. And he said, before that happens, we will scan every page of every one of our ancient texts onto the World Wide Web to preserve for future generations. And this is what they're doing, is they're recording all of the texts that are found in this library for future generations, putting it up onto the World Wide Web. So the question, what is in these texts that's so valuable? What is in these old texts that makes them so powerful? Well, some of the things that are in these texts are icons, pictures of Jesus. This icon was created within 300 years of the death of Jesus from the descriptions of people who lived with him and saw him. This may be one of the closest representations to Jesus that we actually have today. There are old, beautiful, illuminated manuscripts like this. Beautiful books, Coptic, Christian texts. Early Christian Bibles, only 100 or 200, 300 years after the time of Jesus. And this is why I brought you to this monastery. I want to share with you one of these texts. One of the texts that was edited from our Christian Bible is in this monastery. And we saw it, and you'll see a picture of it here. How many have heard of the Lost Gospel of Thomas? The Lost Gospel of Thomas. Some of you have heard of that text. Very, very powerful text. The Lost Gospel of Thomas is powerful because it is believed to be the actual words of Jesus as he was teaching those around him how to use the power of human emotion in his life. Now, I'm going to share two of these images with you. We said earlier, to unleash the force of the divine matrix in our lives, first, we have to understand how it works. And the science tells us how it works. Secondly, we must speak the language that the divine matrix recognizes, and science cannot tell us that. That comes from our past, from our culture, from our history, from those who have learned and used this language for thousands of years. So this is what we're doing right now. We're learning what did Jesus and what did the great masters say about this language. Because it's the same, whether you're talking Buddhist or Hindu or Christian, pre-Christian traditions, they're all telling us that there is a field of energy and that we have the language to use that field. This is an actual page out of the Gospel of Thomas. So we know that this ancient gospel actually existed. And you can see some of the letters. These are Greek letters. You can actually read some of, if you know Greek, you can see some of the Greek letters right here. In the Gospel of Thomas, two very important keys. This was written right around 300 years after the time of Jesus. In this gospel, okay, so here's what we're doing. We've been in the Buddhist monasteries in Tibet, and they're telling us that that feeling is the prayer, one. Two, that we must feel as if our prayers have already been answered. Okay, and now we're in an Egyptian monastery with the texts that used to be our tradition before they were edited. And we're going to look at the instructions that tell us how to do that. Okay if we do that? Is that good? Okay. Gospel of Thomas. If you have a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, this is verse 106, translated from the Nag Hammadi Library. And if you do not have a copy, it's in our books, and you can go to any library and pick this up. Verse 106. Look at what the Lost Gospel of Thomas says. It says, when you make the two thought and emotion one. So the Gospel of Thomas is talking about thought and emotion. It's saying when you make your thought and your emotion one, look at what happens. You will say to the mountain, mountain, move away, and the mountain will move away. It's saying that when you can marry your thought and your emotion into one single potent force, that is when you have the power to speak to the world. The tumor that disappeared in the woman this morning, that is an example. When those practitioners had the thought of the woman being healed and the feeling and the emotions were all one, the mountain moved, the tumor disappeared. Okay, so this is one place. Now, secondly, when you make the two one, what are they talking about? What are the two? Let's go back to our image. The two, thought and emotion. When the two become one in our hearts, we create the feelings in our bodies. When thought and emotion become one, and you'll see how to do that in just a minute. Let's go back to the Gospel of Thomas, another verse. Now this is verse 48. It says almost the same thing. This was so important that it was recorded at least 3 different times in the same gospel. Look at what this says. If the two make peace with each other in this one house. When Jesus is talking about the house or the temple, what is he talking about? What is he talking about? Precisely you. You are the house. You are the temple. If the two make peace with each other in this house, if thought and emotion become one, if they make peace with each other in this house, look what happens. They will say to the mountain, move away, and it will move away. He's telling us again, in a completely different verse, how powerful it is to marry thought and emotion. But they still haven't told us how. How do you do this? That's the next piece. In the early Christian Bible, your Bible today, there is a passage. How many have heard, ask and ye shall receive? Have you heard that before? Ask and ye shall receive. Have you heard that? I know people that ask and ask and ask and nothing happens. Because the asking is not done with the voice. The asking is not done, please, please, bring this to my world. That's not asking. To ask, we must speak to the field, to the divine matrix, in the language that the field recognizes. And a language that's meaningful. The field doesn't recognize our voice, it recognizes the power of our heart. Remember this morning, our heart, we have a feeling, creates electrical waves, magnetic waves. That's the language the field recognizes. So when you create the feeling in your heart as if your prayer is already answered, that creates the electrical and the magnetic waves that bring that answer to you. And you're going to see this in just a moment. Ask and ye shall receive. While we still have this passage in our text, in the Bible that you have today, the King James Version, John 16, 23, 24, what you have is the condensed version. You have the edited version. The edited version looks like this. This is the edited version. Whatsoever ye ask the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Hitherto have ye asked nothing in my name. Okay? Ask and ye shall receive, that your joy may be full. Okay, this is the edited version. This is so amazing to me because they took out the 2 sentences that tell us how to ask. Because so far you've not, with our voice, we have not done this. Now here's the piece that was edited. Here is what was lost. Look at these two very powerful sentences. Ask without hidden motive and be surrounded by your answer. Be enveloped by what you desire, that your gladness be full. Look at what it's saying. It's not saying to speak a word. It's saying to be surrounded, to feel as if. If you are surrounded, you are feeling as if your answer has already happened. Be enveloped. If you want the perfect relationship in your life, if you want the healing in the body of your loved ones, feel the feeling of what it is like as if that has already happened. Be enveloped by what you desire, because that is when your thought and your emotion become one. You think the thought of the healing in your loved ones, and you feel the love of that thought. They become one, and that is the language that this field recognizes. Does that make sense? Are you okay with that? You're going to see an example of this, another example here in just a moment. Ask without hidden motive. What does that mean? Hidden motive. Ask without judgment. This is precisely what the Buddhists are telling us. Ask without the judgment of the right or the wrong or the good or the bad. Ask without the ego. Ask from the heart. Is this meaningful to you? Is this helpful at all? Let me give you an example then. Because to be, if it says be surrounded, that means to feel as if. To feel as if. Now, if that sounds too religious, because it's from the Bible, we spoke this morning about Neville, the philosopher Neville, early in the 20th century. His book, The Power of Awareness. Look at what he says. It's the same thing. Neville says, you must make your future dream a present fact now by assuming the feeling of your wish fulfilled to come from the place that it's already happened. Now, this is what those practitioners did with that cancerous tumor. I want to just elaborate on this a little bit. When those practitioners healed the woman with her tumor this morning, they did not judge the cancer as wrong or bad or right or good. There was no judgment. They accept that tumor as a possibility, one of many possibilities, because in the quantum world, all things are possible. So they didn't say, bad cancer, you must go away. Or we're going to operate on you, or we're going to use radiation on you. They didn't do that. They accepted the cancer as it was, without hidden motive, without judgment. And they said, now we're going to choose a new reality by feeling, assuming the feeling as if the woman is already healed. So what they did was they felt the feeling as if the woman was fully healed, fully enabled, fully capacitated, already happened. And the chant that they were using, wasa, wasa, loosely translates into the words, already done. Already done. And then when they got excited, they said, mate, means now, not a year from now, not a month from now, not 5 minutes from now, in the quantum world, now. And her body responded. It must. Physical reality must respond to the language that it understands. So in the Buddhist traditions, they are telling us the quality of the feeling. And in the Judeo-Christian traditions, they are giving us the instructions to be surrounded, to be enveloped, how to create that feeling. And when you put those all together, it's something that happens in our hearts, not in our minds. Feeling as if the prayer is already answered with no judgment and no ego, and feeling from the result. Feeling from the result as if it's already happened. Are there any martial artists here in the room? Karate experts? I studied martial arts when I was in my 20s and 30s, a little bit in my 40s and 50s. Have you seen martial artists when they demonstrate their focus by breaking a concrete block? Have you seen that? You've all seen that before, right? Okay, here's the secret. Here is the secret to breaking that block. When the martial artist is focused on that block, the very last thing that they are thinking is about their hand hitting the block. Because if they think about that, they know it will hurt. So they focus on what happens after their hand has passed through the block, as if it has already happened. They focus on a place below the block and feel the feeling as if their hand is already in that place. That is a metaphor. That is an equivalent for what we're doing with the power of emotion. Feeling as if the experience has already happened. When I left the corporations as an engineer, I moved into the high desert in the United States, a place called Nuevo Mexico, about 3,000 meters above sea level is where my home is. And there are indigenous people, native people in that area in the early 1990s. And it was during this time that this part of our country was experiencing the worst drought in over 100 years. No rain during this time. And a native friend of mine called me one day, and he said, "Greg, would you like to come with me to a place, a very special place, where my ancestors have gone for many, many years to pray rain?" So would you like to come with me to pray rain? Now, I like the language that he used, because he said this place is special because the skin between the worlds is very thin in this place. I like that language. So I met my friend, and we went to this place, and it was a circle of stones, kind of like this. Not this exact place, but very similar to this place. Now, I was not prepared for what I saw, because I believed I would see some dancing, some chanting, some singing, some Native American stuff. And that's not what happened at all. My friend sat down and took off his old shoes. With his naked feet, he stepped into the stone circle. He honored his past. He said the words, "All of my ancestors, all of my ancestors, all of my ancestors are with me now." And then he closed his eyes and he held his hands in a prayer mudra like this. And he turned his back to me for about 20 seconds. And then he looked at me and he said, "I'm hungry. Would you like to go get food?" And I said, "Yes, but I thought you were going to pray for rain." And this is when he looked at me and he said, "No." He said, "If I pray for rain, rain could never happen." He said, because the moment you pray for something, You have just acknowledged it is not here now. If you say, "Dear God, please let there be rain. Please let there be healing in my loved ones. Please let there be peace in the world. Please let my soulmate come into my life." If you say that, what you're acknowledging is that it is not here now. You remember, the divine matrix is very literal. If you say, "Please let," the divine matrix says, "Okay, I will let and let and let," because there is no completion, there is no outcome. Does that make sense? So I asked my friend, his name was David. I asked my friend David, I said, "If you did not pray for rain just now, what did you do when you closed your eyes?" Such a beautiful story. He said, "When I closed my eyes, I felt the feeling as if the rain has already happened." He said, "I felt the feeling of what it feels like to feel my naked feet in the mud in my pueblo because there has been so much rain." He said, "I smelled the smell of what it smells like when the rain falls off of the earthen pueblo walls in our village." And he said, "I felt the feeling of what it feels like when I run through the fields of corn and the corn is so high because there's been so much rain." He said, "And then I gave thanks of gratitude and appreciation for the rain that has already happened." So he didn't ask for the rain. Now, this is interesting. When those practitioners worked on the woman with the cancerous tumor, they did not judge the tumor as right, wrong, good, or bad. They accepted it as it was, and they said, "Now we're going to make a new reality." When my friend David prayed rain, he did not judge the drought. He said, "This drought is our medicine until now, and now we will create new medicine." This is key. Feeling as if it has already happened. Well, I'll tell you the rest of the story. We had lunch that day. By the time I got back onto my property that afternoon, something began to happen that had not happened for a long time. Big black clouds were coming in from the eastern mountains, and it began to rain that afternoon. And it rained that night. It rained the next morning. It rained into the afternoon. By the evening, it had rained so much and the ground was so dry that it began to flood. The roads were flooded. The crops were flooded. The cattle were stranded. And I called my friend David on the phone and I said, "This is a mess." I said, "What in the world is going on?" And he said, "That's the part of the prayer the ancestors could never really explain." It's like they could get the rain to begin, but they didn't know how to tell it how much to rain. Now, I cannot prove to you scientifically that David's prayer made that rain happen. I cannot prove scientifically that those practitioners made the tumor disappear. But we can say there's a high correlation, a very high correlation between when they feel the feelings and when the change happens. Okay, now there's more to this story. This is very interesting. Within the last month, I was on tour in Australia with a dear friend, Dr. Bruce Lipton. I know many of you know Bruce Lipton's work. I will meet him in Vienna tomorrow. And we are presenting in Vienna, in Zurich, in Frankfurt, in Hamburg over the next week. So if you have friends who are interested, please let them know. Can we bring the light down just a poquito? Just a little bit. It's a little washed out, isn't it? It needs just... That's good. Just a little bit. Thank you. So we were in Australia last month. While we were in Australia, something happened. Look at this. While we were in Australia, Prime Minister John Howard made an announcement. He said the rivers of Australia have dried up. There is no water. It's all dust. This is a river. This is a riverbed right here. He said there is no water for crops, no water for cattle, no water for irrigation. Australia is in big, big trouble right now. This is the front page of the Australian newspaper. John Howard asked the nation to pray for rain. What happens if you pray for rain? Okay. But there's more to the story. Because Bruce Lipton and I were in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, doing these seminars. And there were people from the government in the audience. The next day, look at what happened. They declared a national rain day. But look at this. The idea was inspired by Greg Bradon's book, The Isaiah Effect, in response to Prime Minister John Howard calling on the Australians to pray for rain. Before we left Australia, something began to happen. And it started to rain, and it rained, and rained, and rained. And we were in Sydney, and it rained so much that the streets were flooded, and people were not prepared. But the good news is that it is raining in Australia. Now, I cannot say scientifically that those prayers made that rain happen. But I can say there's a high correlation between the time the prayers happened and when the rain occurred. And this is a connection that our ancestors have told us for hundreds and thousands of years, that we can speak to the elements of the earth. We can speak to our bodies. We can speak to the world around us to create peace. In the early 1980s, Israel and Lebanon were in the first Israeli-Lebanese war, the first war. Researchers from the United States performed an experiment in the Middle East. They trained individuals to feel the feeling as if peace is already happened.
Do it in a useful sense where...
This was the very famous experiment. Orm, Johnson, Alexander, Davies, Chandler, Larimore were the authors of the experiment. The experiment was called the International Peace Project in the Middle East. The results of this experiment were so profound that they were published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Volume 32, 1988. So the reference is here if you'd like to see this for yourself. Here's what happened. They trained individuals to go into the war-torn areas and feel the feeling as if peace has already happened. They did not judge the war. They did not judge the Israelis good or bad, or the Palestinians good or bad, or the Lebanese good or bad. There's no judgment, no ego. They simply went in and felt as if the peace has already happened. Just like David felt as if the rain has already happened. Just like the practitioners felt as if the woman is already healed. You see where we're going with this. And what happened was each time the practitioners performed this experience, peace happened in the Middle East. Terrorist activities stopped altogether. Crimes against people declined. Emergency hospital room visits declined. Automobile accidents declined. And when the people stopped their feelings, all of those statistics reversed. Everything went back to where it was. And the researchers said, well, maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe it's a holiday. Maybe it's a full moon. Maybe there are more people on the streets today than yesterday. So they did the experiment again and again and again, and every time the results were the same. In fact, they were able to determine how many people it takes to feel peace for peace to happen in that area. And here's what they found. Very small number. They said if you can get the square root of 1% of your population to feel peace, peace will happen. What does that number look like? Well, let me show you the math. These are very small numbers. The square root of 1% of the population. If you have a city of 1 million people, how many people are in Milan? Do we know? Approximately? 5 million? So, okay. Yeah, well. So, muchos personas, right? Okay, if you have a city of 1 million people, here's how the formula works. You take the number of people, total number of people, multiply by 1%, so 1 million times 0.01 gives you the number 10,000. Okay, now you take the square root of 10,000, 100 people. In a city of 1 million people, if there are 100 people that know the language of peace, they can begin that experience of peace. What does that mean for our planet? Let's look at our planet. Earth has a population a little over 6 billion people now, close to 6.5. If we do the same thing, 1% of 6 billion people is 60 million people. If you take the square root of 60 million people, the number is just under 8,000, 7,746 people. There are 1,000 people in this room. 7 rooms like this can change the world. And that's just the beginning. What happens if many, many people come together on the internet, on the World Wide Web? They coordinate and create that peace. Well, it has happened. It's been done. Princeton University organized the studies. And while the people are feeling peace, all that happens is peace. The problem is that people stop feeling peace and then walk away from the experiment and everything changes. So what I'd like to do is this. We're going to go into the last part of the program in just a few moments. Before we do that, we'll take our bathroom break. We come back, we're going to look at this a little bit more, and then we're going to have some experience in the room that helps us know what this feeling is all about. Okay, do you have an announcement you'd like to make? Okay, if we could do 15-minute bathroom break, I'll meet you back here 15 minutes. Thank you for a really, really wonderful session. Thank you. So this is a very fast day. We have a little bit more I'd like to share and have some experience here in the room. This morning, we spoke about the Institute of Heart Math, their discoveries that every human heart, around the heart, is a field of energy. 5 to 8 feet, 2 to 3 meters diameter. And this field of energy can be measured now in ways that make it very useful to us. So this field of energy, if you...
Shaving cream.
So for the next few moments, I would like to share with you the science. And I think you'll enjoy the science very much, because it gives us a way to understand what we will see next. After we understand the science, I'd like to invite you into the monasteries of Tibet, into the monasteries of Egypt and Peru, because it's in those places that the wisdom is kept of the language of our hearts, the wisdom in their cultures that was lost in our cultures. So as we go through the day, I'm sharing the science, and then we will go into the ancient wisdom that describes the science in another language. And then we will see miraculous video in here of that science applied to create healing inside the body of a living human. We will see a woman that has been diagnosed with cancer, and we can see inside of her body through ultrasound, through a sonogram. And we can watch this practice of human emotion, focused human emotion, heal that cancer in less than 3 minutes for one person. And then we'll see the same principle applied for peace in the Middle East during the Israeli-Lebanese War in the early 1980s, because it's the same principle. And then we'll have the opportunity in this room to learn the language that creates those miracles. Is that okay? Are you okay if we do that today? So, okay, good. Thank you. So the question, how much power do we really have to change our world, to change our lives, to change our bodies? How much power do you believe that we really have? The question that we're really asking is, who are we? Who are we? And this is the great mystery and the controversy in the language of science. Are we simply observers, passive observers in this universe, watching the world go by, or are we powerful creators? As our most cherished religious and spiritual traditions have always said, are we actually powerful creators that have forgotten how to use our power? Well, this is the great question that has been asked by scientists for 400 years. When I was in school in the 1970s, 1960s, I was taught that the universe began a long time ago, and that we have come along relatively recently, and that we are essentially powerless specks of dust in the universe. And after we are gone, the universe will never know that we were here. That's what I was taught when I was in school. Does that sound familiar to you? That's one way of thinking. There is another way of thinking that says something very different. It says the universe began a long time ago. We have come along relatively recently. However, we are powerful creators that are changing our world and changing the universe as we live our lives. And this is the controversy of the scientists. Albert Einstein believed the first idea. Albert Einstein said, we live in a world which exists independently of us humans, which stands before us like a great eternal, at least partially accessible to our inspection and thinking. It's very complex. What he's saying is, Albert Einstein believes that we will be lucky if we understand even a little bit of how the universe works, and that we are very insignificant. Okay. A colleague of Albert Einstein was alive during his time and is still alive today. His name is Professor John Wheeler, Princeton University physicist. He's still with us today. John Wheeler says completely the opposite. They studied in the same time. They had the same information, the same books, the same data, and they had very different opinions. Look at what John Wheeler says. John Wheeler says we could not even imagine a universe that did not contain us, because he says it is the act of us observing the universe that makes the universe as it is. He said it is the act of us observing the world around us. He said that we're part of a universe that is not finished yet. John Wheeler says the universe is incomplete. He says that we are tiny specks, tiny patches of the universe looking at itself and building itself in what he calls a participatory universe. Participatory. I like that word. It means that we are not controlling the universe. We are not imposing our will upon the universe. We are participating, co-creating. Does that mean anything to you when you see this? Let me ask you a question. Let's explore this idea just a little bit. I know that you all lie awake in bed at night, sleepless, because you're wondering why we have never found the smallest particle of matter, right? Or you lie awake in bed at night, sleepless, because you wonder why we've never found the edge of the universe, right? No, I do. The truth is that we may never find the smallest particle of matter. And we may never find the edge of the universe. Scientists build huge machines, cyclotrons, particle accelerators. And they take a little particle of matter and they accelerate it to the speed of light, almost. And they smash it into another particle so they can break it into many pieces, thinking that somewhere in there they will find the ultimate, smallest particle of matter. And they never find it. Do you know why? Because here's what happens. Every time they think they find the smallest particle, they look and there's something else there. Something else is there. The reason that we will probably never find the smallest particle, and the reason that we will probably never find the edge of the universe, is because of what John Wheeler says. He says the act of us searching, the act of the human heart and the human mind looking at the universe, expecting to see something, will always create something for us to see. The act of us looking with the expectation that something is there is an act of creation unto itself. Does that make sense to you? This is important. This is important to you. Think about this. I invite you to think about this. If looking with the expectation that something exists is what creates that something, then what does it mean when you are conditioned to look at your body, to search your body every day or every week, looking for something to be wrong, looking for an abnormality, looking for a lump, looking for a discoloration? You know what I'm talking about, right? I'm not saying don't look. What I'm suggesting is it's your consciousness while you are looking that is important. What happens if you look at your body in the mirror every day and you say, beautiful body? And that is an act of creation. Can you see how that is different than if you look in your body for a lump or something that should not be there? Does that make sense? Very, very powerful, what John Wheeler is saying. This is a scientist saying that consciousness is creating our physical universe. The question is, if feeling and consciousness is creating, what is it that we feel? What do we believe about our world? The new discoveries suggest that the power to change our bodies and to change our world is based in what we call belief. Belief. Our belief of what is real. We live our lives based in what we believe about our world. Would you agree with that? We live our lives based on what we believe about ourselves, our world, one another, our limitations, our capabilities. I was trained as a scientist. When I began to understand that we live our lives based upon our beliefs, my question is, where do those beliefs come from? And what I found is that those beliefs come from what other people tell us. The beliefs come from what history tells us, what science tells us, what religion tells us, what our culture, what our family, our friends tell us. That's where our beliefs come from. Would you agree with that? So let me ask a question. What if they're wrong? What if they're wrong? What if you and I are living our lives in the beliefs of other people who are incorrect? What does that mean for us? How powerful do you think a belief really is? How powerful, truly? There's an author. His name was Neville in the early 20th century. He wrote a book called The Power of Awareness, a beautiful book. And what Neville said was this. He said that our power of belief is a power, an infinite power against which no earthly force is of the slightest significance. Our power of belief is an infinite power against which no earthly force is of the slightest significance. Do you believe that you have a power within you against which no earthly force is of the slightest significance? Is that possible? Do you believe that? Let me show you some examples. Let me share some examples of miracles. You've all heard these stories before. You've heard stories of miracles. This is a story of a woman who lifted a car 20 times her body weight to free a person who was trapped underneath the car in an accident. You've heard stories like this. She freed this person. She went to the hospital with this person. She waited in the waiting room. The doctor came out and said, "This man will live because you lifted the car and saved his life." And when she heard the words that described what she did, she passed out. Unconscious. Because she had done something that even she couldn't believe. She wasn't thinking about it. All she said, "I just knew I had to get him free, and there was no one else around at the time." How many in this room are fire walkers? Fire walkers. Do you walk the fire pit? Okay, a few. On June 15th, 2005, Amanda Dennison, Alberta, Canada, entered the book of world records for the longest fire walk. Look at this walk. She crossed this pit, 220 feet long. I don't know how many meters that is. Approximately? Okay, it's a big fire pit. Big pit. averaging 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. She crossed this uninjured. This is a picture of Amanda walking through the coals. This is a picture of Amanda after the walk. And the question, she has no injuries. The question is why? Why no injuries? It's because of her beliefs. The woman lifted the car 20 times her body weight because of her beliefs. Amanda walked through the fire because of her beliefs. These are examples we see every day of a power within us. But they're rare examples. What if they become everyday examples? Miracles of belief. We ask the question, who are we? What we know is that we're made of quantum energy. You all have heard that we are quantum energy, yes? Yes? Okay. For 70 years, scientists have been telling us that we are little particles of quantum energy. And now we believe them. But now scientists say those little quantum particles can do miraculous things, amazing things. But the scientists say those miracles have nothing to do with your life. For example, quantum particles, we know, can exist as a physical particle, like this. It's a quantum particle. That particle can exist invisible. The particle is still there. It has just changed its form. Quantum particles can exist in one place in a moment in time. Quantum particles can exist in two places or many places at the same time, and they are always connected. They are always connected with one another. So the particles are always connected. Quantum particles can communicate with themselves in the past and in the future. This is very interesting. Scientists can take a quantum particle and they know everything there is to know about this particle. They know its rotation, its plus, its minus, its charge in the present, now. Okay? They can take it into the future, and now this is the past, this is the future. Okay? You okay so far? All right, now. They can change the particle now, and it changes what it had to be in the past to get to now. They can change the particle in the present, and it changes the particle in the past, even though the past already happened. Very interesting. So the question is, we're made of those particles. So can we do what these particles can do? We're made of quantum particles. Are they showing us our limits, or are they showing us our possibility, our potential? What do you think? Are those quantum particles that we're made of showing us limitations or possibilities? I think so. I think so. And I think you'll see why in just a moment. Can we do everything that those particles can do? The answer is yes. But it's based on what we believe to be true. Not what we think in our minds. What we believe in our hearts. And that is a very subtle, very powerful difference. Not the mind, the heart. We're made of those particles. We are held together through a focus, a force. This is a clue. What is the force that holds our quantum particles together as our bodies? What is the force that begins with the letter C that holds all of the particles of your body together? What is that force called? Anyone? No, it starts with a C. Okay, there it is. Consciousness. Consciousness. Very good. Some yes, some not so good. Consciousness is what holds these particles together. Consciousness organizes the particles into your body and into this world. 1944, the father of quantum theory, his name was Max Planck. Max Planck made this statement. He said, the stuff of our world does not exist the way we think it exists. Max Planck said, as a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell you as a result of my research about the atoms this much. Okay? There is no matter as such. What he's saying is the stuff that we're made of does not exist the way we believe it exists. He goes on to say that what we think is matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. He said there's a force out there that holds everything together in our bodies and in our world. He said we must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious mind, an intelligent mind. He said this mind is the matrix of all matter. This mind is the matrix of all matter. If you saw the movie, The Matrix, this is where the movie was based from. This information. The father of quantum theory, Max Planck, said that there is an energy, a field of energy that holds everything together, that this is not solid and we are not solid. Belief is the code that takes that field of energy, possibilities, and translates that field into the reality of this world. Belief is the code that translates possibilities into the reality of this world. Here's what scientists say to us about the way this world works. Scientists are telling us now that in this field, all possibilities already exist in the quantum energy, in the soup of quantum possibility. All possibilities already exist. In the quantum possibilities, you are already healed.
What's this? Mia, what's this?
Understand what they're doing. So it's not exactly spatial territory. It's more like temporospatial territory. It's time and space, because the same place can be a different place from one moment to the next. And that happens all the time when some event that you don't expect occurs in the place that you are. So, and your body is prepared to react. It's instinctively prepared to react to the emergence of chaotic circumstances. It basically does that by hyperactivating your preparation for action and increasing your capacity to pay attention and preparing you to do a very large number of things at once because you don't know what to do. It's a high-stress reaction, but it's built into you. And it's so interesting because what that means that is part of what's built into people is the ability to deal with what they don't understand. This is a real paradox, right? Because how can you deal with what you don't understand? You don't understand it. So, but the answer is, well, you ramp up your ability to react in a very large number of ways, and you do that by increasing your general level of arousal and your attention. And it's that also increases the probability that you're going to be attentive to new information and pull it in and utilize it so that you can decide how to act rapidly. So, other things happen. For example, some of you may have been in car accidents or events like that where you knew for a few seconds that the event was going to occur and time slowed down. It's quite a commonly reported phenomenon. I've experienced it a number of times, actually. And it was actually experimentally tested. They threw people off bungee cord apparatuses, so they were plummeting down in a quite frightening manner, and had them look at digital timers that were flashing information while they were falling, and it turned out that the people who were falling could process the digital information faster than people who were just standing there under normal circumstances. How they got that past an ethics committee is beyond me, but it really is a brilliant experiment. For us, consciousness is associated with enlightenment and illumination and daytime and sunrise and the bright noon sky, and the unconscious is associated with the nighttime. And the reason for that partly too is that your unconscious is actually a lot more active at night. First of all, that's when you dream. And it's also the time when, if you're frightened of something or if you're depressed and ruminative, the frightening thoughts and the depressing and ruminative thoughts are going to come up. So many, many people have the experience of waking up in a kind of quasi-cold sweat at 3 in the morning and having, nothing but a continual stream of worries run through their head. And there's pretty good evidence that a lot of what you're doing at night when you sleep, when you're dreaming and when you're not dreaming, is actually processing threat. But most of the time you're asleep for that. Sometimes you wake up during it and it's like, it's not something you really want to be conscious about, It's hard on you, and it's very, very common among people who are depressed, So if you want to diagnose someone for depression, one of the things you ask them is, well, is your sleep chopped up? Do you wake up multiple times at night? And when you wake up, what happens? And if they say, well, I have worries running through my head and I can't stop them, that's rumination, because it's an automatic process. It's an unconscious process. Then you know that the balance between positive and negative emotion has shifted too far for that person. There's so much chaos and pain in their life, or their emotional systems have become dysregulated, that it's starting to pop up into consciousness and dominate it. So, now, the yin-yang symbol is interesting for a variety of other reasons too, because the Taoists believe that that symbol represents being. Now, being is not the same thing as objective reality. Being is what you experience as a conscious creature. That's being. And for the Taoists, being is made up of these two elements, order and chaos. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. The reason for that is wherever you go, and whenever you live, and whoever you are, each environment that you're in is composed of things you understand, and things that work the way you expect them to, and things you do not understand, and that can pull the rug out from you at any moment. And so you can say in some sense that these symbolic representations are representations of the most unchanging elements of being. So the most real things, because, a typical modern person will look at this and think, well, those aren't real. It's like, they are real. In fact, they're hyper-real. Because one of the things that defines real is that it's permanent. And it is permanent. No matter where you go, there are things you know and things you don't know. And it doesn't matter who you are. It's permanent. So it's part of the existential landscape of human being. Now, the other thing there's two other things that are quite cool about the yin-yang symbol. And one is that each of the black paisley has a little white dot in it, and the white paisley has a little black dot in it. And the reason for that is the Taoists also recognize quite well that chaos could turn to order at any moment. So a new order can arise out of a chaotic structure. That's a revolution in some sense. But by the same token, if you're in a place that's orderly and predictable, something can happen that casts you into a chaotic situation right away. So there's a dynamic, even though these two things oppose each other in some sense, there's a continual dynamic interplay between them. And then the final thing that's quite interesting about this symbol, this is a mind-bogglingly brilliant idea, is that, because the Tao also means the way, and the way is the line between the two. And so what that indicates is, this is a brilliant idea, is that the optimal position for a human being isn't in chaos or in order, because if it's too much order, then it's totalitarian, and if it's too much chaos, then it's disgust and fear and emotional pain and depression. So where's the proper place? And the Taoist answer is right on the line, where you have one foot in order so that you're fairly stable, and you have another foot in chaos so that new and interesting and compelling and transforming things are happening to you. And one of the things that you might note is that your nervous system basically tells you when you're there, and the way it tells you is by making you interested in whatever it is that you're engaged in. Because the fact that the thing that you're engaged in grips you, which is really an unconscious process, you can't really control that, it's something that happens to you, is because your nervous system, which is actually adapted to the environment of chaos and order, is telling you that if you're engaged and interested, you are in the place where the balance between chaos and order is perfect. Now you think about that. It's no use reading a paper that you cannot understand at all, even though hypothetically that would be a tremendously informative paper, right? But you can't understand it because it's all chaos to you. And then there's absolutely no reason reading a paper the 10th time if you've already extracted the information out of it. It's going to be boring. Okay, so what do you want? Well, you want a paper that you can almost understand. So there's, the frameworks, the cognitive frameworks that you have at hand are sufficient for you to take the next step into the unknown, and the paper will inform you of that. And so those are the sorts of things. Books do that, movies do that, conversations do that, even lines of thought do that. If they're exactly at the right level of complexity for you, they're going to engage you. And people know this, man. They know it. So here's an example. Let's say you're trying to, we could say you're trying to teach your child to talk, which of course you don't do. What you do to a child is talk to it. But it's very interesting because there have been studies of how parents talk to children. And what they do is always use language that's slightly more complex than the child can understand. And they do it automatically. It's part of our, in some sense, our innate knowledge structure about language. So you don't only use words that the child understands. Use words that they understand, plus a few words and phrases and sentence constructions that they don't. And so that's sort of pulling them along. And a Russian psychologist named Vygotsky called that the zone of proximal development. And the zone of proximal development is that place, because it's a place in the environment where information flow into the psyche is maximized. And that has to be, so it has to be quasi-comprehensible. It's something I try to do in my lectures. I try to tell you things that you know and associate them with things that you don't know so that you're not swamped, hopefully, by an excess of incomprehensible information, but you don't think, oh God, he's saying that again, I already know that, et cetera, et cetera. And anything that's dramatic in structure is doing that for you. It's keeping you on the edge of attention. And that place is where your adaptation is maximized because not only are you firming up the structure that's underneath your feet, you're relying on it, and it's part of the platform on which you stand, but you're absorbing information at a rate that allows you to increase the solidity and area of that solid ground without undermining you so much that it falls apart beneath you. So it's lovely. It's such a good idea because think about what it would mean if it was true. It would mean that if you pay attention to what captures your interest and you follow that, that means you're going to always be interested in what you're doing. But even better than that, it's going to mean that you're going to maximize your adaptive capacity as much as possible at exactly the same time. Man, that'd be a great deal if it actually happened to be true. Now, it's a bit complicated because what culture wants from you and what is intrinsically interesting to you, there's going to be a conflict there, right? Because culture wants you to do what a good cultural entity should do, which is to do what you're told to do. But you're not a robot. And so part of the existential problem that you have in life is trying to figure out some compromise between what you find personally engaging and that develops and supports you and what the culture will provide resources to you for pursuing. And it's hard. There's no simple answer to it. But I would say that if you sacrifice your capacity to engage in meaningful activity to the security of a given position in a dominance hierarchy, then you turn into something that's like a soulless slave. And that's a really bad idea because there's no way you can do that for any length of time without getting bored and resentful. And once you're bored and resentful, the move from that to dangerous is a very, very small step. So it's hard, and it isn't even necessarily the case that you're going to make the balance. You're going to be able to manage it. But if you don't, you're going to pay a massive price for it. So I would say, don't let people mess around with what you find compelling any more than is absolutely necessary. So because it's very dangerous to do that. It's very dangerous to do that. Just like it's dangerous not to find a position in a dominance hierarchy at all, because then you end up in a chaotic place. And my experience has been, you might wonder about this, it's like, what's the probability that someone can live a healthy life, healthy, productive, and stable life outside a dominance hierarchy, so without external structure? And the answer to that is, there might be one person in this class that could do that. It's really hard, because what happens to most people is that if they don't have a substantial amount of external structure and routine, they just fall apart. They don't sleep properly, they don't eat properly, they're depressed. It's tremendously effortful to continually reinvent yourself day after day. And so there's some real utility in routine and social identity. And Jung would say the part of you that has adapted to routine and social identity is the persona, and sort of the mask you wear in public. It might even be who you think you are. And he thought that people who were only persona were dangerous, because they were only thoughtless advocates of the system for which they stood. But he also believed that people who had no persona were in an equally terrible situation, because they're psychologically chaotic and they don't have a social structure around them to hem them in and continually remind them how to be sane and productive. So it's a matter of balance, There's horrors on both sides, and there's advantages on both sides, and the trick is to place yourself in a location where you're deriving maximal advantage from both. And you'll be able to tell if you do that, because if you are doing that, you're going to find your life engaging and meaningful enough, so the fact that it's also tragic and potentially composed at least partially of slavery is going to be acceptable. And that's the goal in some sense. It's hard to do that, but, it's hard not to do it too. So you're screwed either way. So you might as well pick the path that's going to be of maximal utility to you. And hopefully to everyone else. Okay, so this is the individual instead. So we have explored territory, unexplored territory, or the known and unknown, or order and chaos, and then we have the thing that mediates between them, and that's the individual. And this is an old medieval representation, which I really love. There's the dome of the sky there. It's a very archaic idea that the earth is a dome, because it kind of looks like that if you go out in a flat field, if you're out in the ocean, the world looks like a dome on a disc. And so that's sort of the representation here. It's a very ancient idea. And this guy at the bottom left of the picture is poking his head through the comprehensible world and looking at the chaos beyond. And so he's a heroic figure. So the knower is the individual, is always the hero of a story, right? The protagonist of a story. Now, it can be an anti-hero too, because just like the known has a negative element and a positive element, and the unknown has a negative element and a positive element, the individual has a negative element and a positive element.
About to join me now is probably the world's most famous intellectual, certainly the most famous intellectual to come out of Canada in the last 20 years. And he will be speaking with me about the role of the university and about his meteoric rise to intellectual and media influence. Dr. Jordan Peterson. Dr. Peterson, I'm going to start on an incidental thing, at least it's incidental to me, and it's bothered me since you became known as it is now to all the world. And that was in the very early days of the controversy that came to you when the University of Toronto sent you some minatory letters that I thought, I've used this word before, insolent, that I thought were against the spirit of a university, that they weren't supporting you, they were actually threatening you.
Yes.
And that said to me that something is beyond the particular controversy. Something deeper is wrong here. That universities, or this university, is upside down. How did you reason that? How did they get there that they could be so completely unaware?
My bad.
Well, men will do it. Some men, very few. A handful of hyper-competitive men who are obsessed. So why work 80 hours a week? Well, men will do it. Some men, very few.
Whoa, watch out!
A handful of hyper-competitive men who are obsessed with hitting the pinnacle of the given dominance hierarchy they're in will happily work 80 hours a week, and they'll forego everything else. Relationships, family, children, way in the second category. And so those men are often very difficult to live with, too, because they're so obsessed with their career. It's hard to have a relationship with them. And maybe they don't have much of a relationship with their kids, but they're damn good at what they do. And part of that is they're smart and disciplined, and they'll work non-stop all the time. It's like an obsession. And that's the sort of people who run things. Those are the people who run things. Well, they're often also disagreeable, too, because you want to manage people? Really? They're not going to like you. You know, and it's not an easy thing to not be liked. And actually, if you're an agreeable person, and women are more agreeable than men, it's quite painful to be disliked. But if you're in a managerial and executive position, the probability that people are going to like you is quite low. Those positions are very stressful, partly because of the interpersonal dynamics, and they're also incredibly, incredibly competitive. So we've got things backwards in our culture. We're thinking, at least in part, why aren't there more women in positions of power? Wrong question. The right question is, why are there any men at all who want those positions of power? Because it's not just positions of power. You have to be such a knothead to think that. Oh, it's a position of power. It's like, sure, but it's a position of overwhelming responsibility. And if you make mistakes, you're done. Right? It's not like you occupy that position of power and everyone does what they're told all the time and your life is easy. It's like, forget about that. People are on your case to do exactly the right thing all the time, 100% of the time. And maybe you want that, and maybe you don't. So I don't know what people think. If these people are all sitting in their offices with their feet up on the desk, smoking cigars and oppressing the world. It's like, that isn't how it works. Those people, they work flat out all the time. So, and it's fine if that's what you want, and some people are like that. They're hyper-industrious people, right, from a trait perspective, no matter where you put them. If you put them in a forest with an axe, they just wander around chopping down trees nonstop, right? Because it's built into them. But if you want to have a balanced life, and you should want that, you know, because the other thing you'll find, and this is God's gospel truth, is that the older you get, if you have any sense at all, the more important your family is to you. Like the utility of your career, maybe that peaks around 35 or 40, and it starts to decline pretty rapidly after that. And what happens, if you're fortunate, you have someone in your life that you love, that you've woven yourself together with, and you have some kids so that you have something to do from the time you're 50 till the time you're 80. And so it's a real mistake. It's a barren future without children, man. I can tell you that. It's a real mistake. And so we do a terrible job of say, putting that image forward and saying, well, yeah, now, you know, because women have access to the birth control pill now and can compete in the same domains as men, roughly speaking, there is a real practical problem here. It's partly an economic problem now, because when I was roughly your age, it was still possible for a one-income family to exist. Well, you know that wages have been flat, except in the upper 1% since 1973. Why? Well, it's easy. What happens when you double the labor force? What happens? You have the value of labor. So now we're in a situation where it takes two people to make as much as one did before. So we went from a situation where women's career opportunities were relatively limited to where they were relatively unlimited and there were two incomes to where, and so women could work, to a situation where women have to work and they only make half as much as they would have otherwise. And now we're going to go into a situation, this is the next step, whereas women will work because men won't. And that's what's coming now. So there was an economist article showing that 50% now of boys in school are having trouble with their basic subjects. And you look around you in universities, you can see this happening. I've watched it over decades. I would say 90% of the people in my personality class are now women. There won't be a damn man left in university in 10 years, except in the STEM fields. And it's a complete bloody catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe for women, because I don't know where the hell you're going to find someone to have to marry and have a family with if this keeps happening. So, and you think when you're 19, because you're so clueless when you're 19, you don't know a bloody thing, you think, well, I'm not really sure I want children anyways. It's like, oh yeah, you tell how well you've been educated. Dismal. Without fail, I got to tell you, without fail, I've watched women go through their professional careers, many, many of them. It's a very rare woman who, at the age of 30, doesn't consider having a child her primary desire. And the ones that don't consider that, generally, in my observation, there's something that isn't quite right in the way that they're constituted or looking at the world. Sometimes you get women who are truly non-maternal, by temperament. They have a masculine temperament, disagreeable. They're not particularly compassionate. They're not maternal. They're not that interested in kids. Fair enough, man. But there aren't that many of them, and there's plenty who will not admit to themselves that that's what they most desperately want.
That's why so many women hate him, because what he just said right there. Doesn't make it less true. I'm not saying it's true or not true. There's no way for me to fucking know that, baby. None. No way for me to know that. But I'm just saying that's probably why a lot of women hate him, because of what he just said there. It's not their fault, and it's not his fault. They're going by what they've been taught. He's going by what he's been seeing, and they both disagree with each other, and that's that. I mean, not more you can do.
Speaking of envy and resentment, would you care to comment on the apparently well-established neo-Marxist idea that men have a common collective interest, and women have a separate common collective interest, a class interest, and that these interests they come into conflict, that there's a competition, in some sense, on a collective level?
Well, I think there is competition between men and women, but it's nested inside a broader arena of cooperation. This is another thing that you learn from reading Piaget, if you're careful, is that, because Piaget was smart enough to understand that there is no dichotomous opposition between cooperation and competition. So, one of the sort of tenets of the kind of leftist mumble-jumble that I hate is that kids shouldn't play competitive games, right? It should be cooperative games. It's like, okay, let's take that apart. Let's take hockey. Is it competitive or cooperative? Well, it's competitive. Well, wait a second. No one brings a basketball to the hockey game, right? No one brings a chessboard. Everyone that comes to the hockey game comes there to play hockey. That constitutes cooperation. We'll mutually define the aim, right? This Piagetian cooperation. We'll mutually define the aim. We'll assign each other roles. We'll all agree to stick to the rules. Well, that's cooperation. And if you break the rules, what happens? You get stuck in the penalty box. You're not playing hockey. Off you go. And people go off. They go sit in the penalty box. They don't go kill the referee with a stick. Like they go and sit in the penalty box. 6'7", 300 pounds. So, okay, and then you think, well, what about within the team? Is that cooperation or competition? Well, each team member is trying to be the best player, but try not passing to your colleagues and see what happens. Even if you're really good, you're just a diva, and no one's going to be happy with you. They'll put horrible things in your beer after the game. So it's cooperation there as well. There's a meta level of cooperation, which is that everybody's trying to improve their skills simultaneously, and so that serves a higher order good. And everyone's trying to learn how to be a good player so that they can play many games. It's like, well, we shouldn't play competitive games. It's like, you must have been educated at OISE. It's sad. It's very sad. And it's so ignorant for people who know something about child development to say something like that. It's just, what is with you? Where were you educated? Or where weren't you educated is the right response. So with men and women, well, there is group competition. For example, you're competing, roughly speaking, with all your classmates, right? And some of the women are going to outshine you. And so that's tough for men. It's particularly tough for men because it isn't obvious how you compete full bore with women. It's not obvious, and we don't know how to solve that problem.
Well, that's a good one, too. That blows my mind every fucking time.
Anyways, so there's social interaction right from the beginning, but for the point of simplification, you might say, well, first the child organizes themselves into a functional unity under the pressure of social dynamics, and then they get unified enough so that they can attain unity with another child by setting up a fictional world and cooperating and competing within that. Because that's quite interesting too, because people often juxtapose cooperation and competition as if they're opposites, but they're not opposites at all. Another Piagetian observation. So you say, well, is hockey a competitive game? And people would say, well, yeah. But then you think, well, really? Really? No one brings a basketball, right? So we're going to play by the rules. That's cooperation. Well, are the teams competing against each other? Well, yes, but they agree to compete within a particular landscape, and they all cooperate to maintain that landscape. And so you do the same thing when you're playing Monopoly. It's like you're trying to win, but at the same time you're cooperating. That's society, man. That's society right there. You're cooperating. That's the big enclosure, and within that there are regulated competitions. But to separate those artificially and say, well, one's competition and the other's cooperation is just not very smart. It's not observant. That isn't how it works. And games are intensely cooperative, even if they're intensely competitive. I mean, the hockey teams are playing the same game. That's the cooperation. Then each team, there's competition within the team to be the best player, let's say. But everyone wants that because everyone wants good players to emerge. But you still cooperate like mad with your teammates. And if you don't pass and play like a reasonable person, then they're going to not be happy with you. And so even within that competition, cooperation is regulating the interactions. And then you can think, this is a really good thing to think too. It's like, people often say to their kids, doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. And the kid, of course, has no idea what that means. It's like, what do you mean? I'm trying to win. And the parent says, no, it matters how you play. And the kid pushes them, and the parents really can't come up with a good explanation of why that's the case. They might say, well, other kids won't play with you. Oh, there you go. Because you could say, this is something to think about. So there's a game, and there's a victory within the game. But then there's the set of all games. And there's victory across the set of all games. And the victory that you attain across the set of all games isn't winning all the games. It's being invited to play all the games. And so if you play fair, then you're playing a metagame. And the metagame is how to win across the set of all games. And so if you teach your child how to behave properly, then they always get invited to play. And that makes them winners. And that's that. And so if you understand that, you understand something phenomenally important about the emergence of morality. Because people, moral relativists in particular, think that morality is relative. And of course, human beings are diverse, just like languages are diverse. And there's more than one playable game, but there's not really more than one playable metagame. It's like you're either the kind of person that other people want to play with, or you're not. And if you're not the kind of person that other people want to play with, then you're a loser. It's as simple as that. And that's true of all cultures. They might be playing different individual games within their culture. Undoubtedly they are. But the set of all games that they play is still common across cultures. That's part of what makes us human. And then you could say as well, we're actually evolved to detect people who are good at playing the set of all possible games. And we actually know that. That's not theoretical. We know, for example, some things are easy to remember and some things are hard to remember. Here's something that's easy to remember. You play with someone and they cheat. Man, you will remember that. That's like in your mind. That's not going anywhere. And so you're great at detecting cheaters. And you remember. And that's because you can't trust a cheater. And you shouldn't invite a cheater to play a game with you because they might cheat. And so that's part of the innate morality system. You remember cheaters because they aren't good at playing the metagame. And of course you're evolved. Of course you're adapted to the metagame because you're the product of this immense evolutionary history, right? And whoever your ancestors were, which is an unbroken string of successful reproducers going back 3.5 billion years. You think about that. Every single one of your ancestors successfully reproduced. It's mind-boggling. The chances against that are it's billions to one. And here you are, the line of 3.5 billion years of success. The whole world was trying to kill you that whole time. And here you are. It's like, but, you're still only going to last about 80 years. So, But that's, still, good for you. So anyways, there were lots of games that your ancestors were playing across that immense span of time. Many, lizard games and tree dweller games and crustacean games, a huge set of games. And you're adapted to win across those games, all of them. And that's built into you, man. That's your central human nature. That's what makes you social. And it's not some mere cultural construct. Quite the contrary. It's so deeply embedded in you. It's what you are.
That was a good one. I gotta say, I might be a little biased. Big Greg fan, but that's not pretty biased.
Of course, there's been an arms race for the development of intelligence between men and women because each gender has to keep up with the other, and women have their own dominance hierarchies. There's certainly no doubt about that. And, of course, now men and women more increasingly compete within the same hierarchies, and we don't exactly know how to sort that out yet because it's an extraordinarily new phenomena. The dominance hierarchy is part of nature, and because it's so ancient, you have to consider it as part of the mechanism that has played the role of selection in the process of natural selection. And so, roughly, what seems to happen is that there is a plethora of dominance hierarchies, especially in complex human communities, and many of them are masculine in structure in that there are dominance hierarchies that primarily men compete in, or that has been the historical norm, and that some men rise to the top based on whatever the dominance hierarchy is based on, and they make their preferential mates. And it's a good strategy for women to engage in because and many sorts of female animals do precisely this, is they let the males battle it out and then pick from the top. Or often the dominant males, there's no choice on the part of the females. It's the dominant males just chasing away the subordinate males. But with humans, it's usually the case that the females have the opportunity to do at least some choosing. And so we have, if you think about that, what that implies is that we have evolved to climb up dominance hierarchies. And then I would say it's not exactly that even because there are many different dominance hierarchies. And so the skills that you might use to climb up one might not be necessarily the same skills that you would use to climb up another. And so then I would say what we have evolved for instead, and I'm still speaking mostly on the masculine edge of things, historically speaking, is the ability to climb up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies, right? And that's a whole different idea. It's like the averaged hierarchy across vast spans of time. And I think it's for that reason that we, among others, that we evolved general intelligence, because general intelligence is a general problem-solving mechanism, and it seems to be situation independent, so to speak. Those who act out the role of the victor in those standard narratives are precisely the people who attain victory in life. And I would say biologically defined in that they make more attractive partners, but also I believe that there's an alignment between human well-being, which is a very weak word, and participation in these meta-narratives that drive success. Because, well, do you want to be a failure or a success? Well, it's hard to be a success. You have to adopt a lot of responsibility, and so you might be willing to take your chances as a failure, but I'm not going to make the presumption that that's going to put you in a situation other than one where you experience a lot of frustration, anger, disappointment, depression, pain, and anxiety. You don't want a factual description of every muscle twitch. You want them to distill their experiences down into the gist, which is the significance of the experience. And the significance of the experience is roughly what you can derive from listening to the experience that will change the way that you look at the world and act in the world. So it's valuable information, and they can tell you a terrible story, and that can be valuable because that can tell you how not to look at the world and act in it, or they can tell you a positive story. You can derive benefit either way, which is why we also like to go watch stories about horrible psychopathic thugs. And hopefully we're learning not to be like them, although there are additional advantages in that, you might say that someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. The worst of all evil predators is the human capacity for evil. And then at that point, you're starting to, I would say, psychologize or spiritualize the idea of danger and make it into something that's conceptual and something that's psychological and something that you can face sort of en masse. I mean, one of the things people had to figure out was, how do you deal with danger? And so you figure out how you deal with a specific danger. But then, because human beings are so damn smart, they thought, well, what if we considered the class of all dangerous things? And then what if we considered a mode of being that was the best mode of being in the face of the class of all dangerous things? Well, that's a lot better. You get to solve all the dangerous problems all at once, instead of having to conjure up a different solution for every dangerous thing. And that's basically, as far as I can tell, where the hero story came from. And the hero story is basically, there's a community, it's threatened by the emergence of some old evil, often represented by a dragon. That's sort of typical, say, of the Lord of the Rings stories. There's a hero, often a humble guy, but not always, sometimes a knight, decides he'll go out there, and chase down the snake, maybe even, or the serpent, or the dragon, maybe even in its lair, and he'll have a bunch of adventures on the way that transform him from, useless, naive hobbit into, sword-wielding hero, and he confronts the dragon and gets the gold and frees the people that it had enslaved, and then comes back transformed to share what he's learned with the community. It's like, well, that's the human story fundamentally, and that's our basic instinctive pattern, and it's represented in narratives. Women play a massive role in sexual selection among human beings, so that from an evolutionary perspective, you're twice as likely to be a failure if you're a man than you are if you're a woman, in that you have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. And you think, well, that's impossible, but it's not. All you have to do is imagine that every woman has one child, half the men have two, and the other half have zero. And so end of problem. And that's basically how it works out. So women are more choosy maters than men by a substantial margin. There was a funny study done by the guy who established one of the big dating sites, and he looked at how women rated men, and they rated the 50th percentile man at the 15th percentile. So 85% of men were below average according to women's ratings. Now, men had their same arbitrary choices because, of course, they preferred younger women to older women, and they were more swayed, I would say, by attractiveness, but that didn't have nearly as big an effect on their actual rating of women. So anyway, so, from a Darwinian perspective, nature is that which selects. So that's all it is. And so sexual selection plays a massive role in human evolution. The fact that we have these massive brains is very likely a consequence of a positive feedback loop in sexual selection. Because otherwise that's the only time you can get really rapid changes in evolutionary space where, you get a process going that reinforces itself. So there's a little preference for intelligence, and then that produces more intelligent men and women, and then there's a little more preference for intelligence, and, maybe then that turns into the ability to speak or to master fire, and then there's way more selection for intelligence, and the brain just goes like this. And women have paid a pretty big price for that because your hips are basically so wide that you can barely run. And if they were any wider, then you couldn't. And of course, the pelvic passageway through which the baby travels is too small. So it's really painful and dangerous. And the baby's head has to compress quite a lot. I mean, they come out cone-shaped often. And then they're born really young. So you have to take care of them forever. Like, what the hell, a deer is born, a fawn is born, and it's like 2 seconds later it's standing, and then it's running from a lion. It's like, it's like 15 minutes later, and a baby, it's like, he just lies there and, utters plaintive noises. So that's all it can do. And it does that for like 10 months before it could skitter away from a sloth if it was predatory, so...
I was talking about you, my baby. I was fucking talking about you, my baby. Yeah, you were not being able to do anything when you were a little tootsie. You just rolled around farting and grunting. And then you got bigger, and now you're a pain in my ass. But I love the pain that you give me because it means I'm alive.
Lions are out hunting for bugs, because he's a lion. He shouldn't be eating bugs, for crying out loud, but they're easy. And so you see this scene where Pumbaa goes after this bug, and then another lion shows up and chases him. So she's going to kill him and eat him. And, see, that's an interesting thing, because one of the things that happens, I suppose you could think about this, one of the things that happens in late adolescence is that the formation of male gangs is often broken up by the proclivity of one or more members of that gang to get involved in an individual romantic relationship. And so the idea that the female lion is the carnivore, the female is the carnivore that will devour the group, is exactly right. And so what a girl will do often if she's in a relationship with, somebody like a young man or an older adolescent is she'll try to separate him from his dopey friends. And like, no wonder, why wouldn't she do that? Because he does have dopey friends, and it'd be better for him if he could get beyond them. And so... anyways, they're pretty freaked out about this. And so then Simba goes out and has a fight with this lion to protect his dopey chums. And I'm sure you don't need any explanation about what that means. And they have this huge fight, and Nala, who it turns out to be, pins him. And so that goes back to the beginning of the story, where when he first encountered her, she pinned him all the time. She's an anima figure, right? And now what she does immediately is shame him. So he's an anima figure in part. She's an anima figure in part because she actually does shame him, right? So she's the gateway to higher consciousness. She makes him self-conscious, and rightly so. But she's also a psychological figure, because imagine that when a young man is establishing a relationship with a young woman and he's enamored of her, he's falling in love, he projects an ideal onto her, and that ideal is going to be partially fulfilled by the relationship. the degree to which is unspecified, and sometimes it'll collapse completely. But he projects an ideal onto her, because otherwise he wouldn't be attracted to her, and then the ideal judges him. And so that makes him feel all self-conscious and useless, which is useful because he is useless and should feel that way. And so it's part of the impetus to growing up. So, and of course, you need necessity in order to mature you, because to mature is to take on responsibility. And you're not going to feel that impetus unless adopting the responsibility has some sort of payoff. And women tend to mate across an up dominance hierarchy, so they tend to actually like men who are useful. And so if they encounter a man who isn't useful at all, that's exactly what's going to happen. They're going to not be happy about that in the least. And no wonder. And I think the reason for that, it's an economic and a biological reason. The reason is that women are in the position of having to take care of infants primarily. And an infant is a very heavy load. And so even a woman who's extraordinarily competent is going to find herself substantially limited in her possibilities if she has an infant. And so then she's looking around for someone who'll pick up part of the load. It's perfectly reasonable. And you're not going to pick up part of the load if you're completely useless. And so it's in the woman's best interest not to have 2 children, roughly speaking. So anyway, she pins him. And then he's all resentful about it immediately, because she's calling him on his stupid friends and the fact that he's out there gallivanting impulsively in paradise when there's real problems to be solved. And so look at him, he's all resentful and useless and feeling put upon and picked upon, and you got to slap him again fundamentally. And she's just completely stunned by that. It's like, and tells him, where's the Simba I used to know, right? He's a little doubtful about the whole situation there. The animators do a very nice job of this part of the movie, because one of the things you see is that his eyebrows are always pointing up in the middle, whereas his father's eyebrows were pointing down in the middle. And so that's the difference between this, which is sort of like things are happening to me, and this, which is more like I'm imposing my will on things. And that's an immature face, and the animators capture that brilliantly. So here's where she shames him again. She tells him how much she liked him when he was little and a potential king, and how hurt she is that he's this useless, wide-eyed, naive, impulsive, pleasure-seeking adolescent. And she tells him that she missed him. And God only knows why, because look at him again. It's like completely appalling creature. And this is when Pumbaa and Timon sing that song about the fact that, their friend's doomed because, this girl's got him. And then they switch into another archetypal scene, and so they're falling in love here. And so the paradisal imagery is really highlighted in the movie. And so they go off and have this like romp, self-reflective romp through this new paradise. And they wrestle around and play. And then he pins her more or less, and she licks him. That's not so good. And this is one of the most brilliant shots, I think, that the animators managed, because she's obviously pushing this a little bit farther than he knows what to do with. And so they're wrestling, and she licks him, and then she lays down and makes this face, which is, every single class I've ever showed this to, all laugh when they see that image. And that's a good example. So Freud said that jokes were a good route into the unconscious. So the question is, and this is an archetypal facial expression, and everyone knows exactly what it means. There's something sexually seductive about it, and something very sexually seductive about it, despite the fact that it's a lioness. And the animators do an extraordinarily good job of capturing that, and so that has a huge effect on him. Well, these guys know that like, the game's up, man. It's like they know they're dead. Whatever attractions they can offer are paling in comparison to this. So anyways, things don't really progress past that, but, he gets a hint of her longing for him, what's waiting for him if he grows up, and the fact that she's completely disappointed in him because he's so completely useless. And so now he's lounging about, like some basement dweller with Cheeto dust all over his chest, and trying to justify his absolutely useless life, and, saying that he doesn't have any responsibility to the devastated kingdom, and he's out there where Hakuna Matata, I can just do whatever I want, and and follow my impulsive pleasures, and she thinks he's pretty pathetic, and the reason for that is because he is actually pretty pathetic, and she tells him that, you know, she's extraordinarily disappointed, and he gets all pouty about it. I mean, even here, you see, when he's got kind of an aggressive look on his face, there's still nothing about it that's commanding. It's petulant, right? It's like, well, now I'm irritated, but he's got no force, and still completely appalling in this particular situation. So she judges him very harshly and leaves, and that makes him think. Yeah, he gets all self-conscious because this female that he admires wants to have nothing to do with him, and so he's, first of all, then he thinks, well, maybe I'll just hate all women, which is, you know, a pretty pathetic conclusion, but a very common one. And the next is, well, maybe there's actually something wrong with him, right? Which is a very painful bit of self-reflection. So he notes that there's something wrong with him, and then he calls out to his father and says, look, you said you were always going to be here for me, and you're not. And so what's happening is that he's become aware of the insufficiency of his current adolescent value structure, and he wants something beyond it, which would be associated with identification with the father. But he can't find the father. The father's dead. It's like when Pinocchio goes down to the bottom of the ocean to bring Geppetto up from the depths, right? That's the situation that Simba finds himself in right now. The father's gone and has to be brought up from the depths. So this is where the movie takes the archetypal pathway of initiation ceremony. So he says he wants to change. Now, one of the things Carl Rogers, one of the clinicians that we'll talk about, pointed out was that if someone was going to come to psychotherapy, there's some things that had to happen before they went into psychotherapy. And one thing that had to happen was that they had to admit that there was something wrong, and they had to want to change. You had to have that before you went into the psychotherapeutic situation. And what happens here is Simba is actually, he's dropped his organ, and he's looking upward, kind of like Geppetto wishing on the star in Pinocchio. He's looking upwards, he's looking towards something higher, and he wants to transform himself. So he's asked the question, how can I change for the better? And he doesn't get an answer. And then Rafiki shows up. So what does that mean? It means that as soon as you know you're wrong about something, as soon as you admit that you're wrong about something, and you open the door to potential change, that part of you will respond. So, and you know this because, think about this.
Nice, eh?
You're thinking. So you ask yourself a question, because that's what you do when you're thinking, and then you generate some answers. It's like, it's very strange. The thinking will actually work. You can actually come up with answers if you think about something. And so this issue is, okay, I thought I was real good in my little impulsive paradise, but then it turns out that I'm just a half-wit, and I noticed that, and I want to do something about it. So the question has now been posed. And what Jung would say is the deeper part of yourself, the part that still contains your undeveloped potential, will respond to that posed question and change the way that you look at things and change the way that you act. It'll start changing things so that you can tap those parts of yourself that are not yet developed. And you certainly do that in psychotherapy, but you can do that. Jung said that psychotherapy could be replaced by a supreme moral effort. And by that he meant was that if you really wanted things to be better, if you wanted to get your act together, and you admitted that you were insufficient in your current state, and you meditated on the issue and tried to figure out what you should do next to put yourself together, that you would be able to find out that there's something in you that guides the process of development. That's the self. It's the higher self in some sense. It's the thing that remains constant across transformations. You know, because you're somewhere, then you fall apart, then you get somewhere else. But there's something outside of that that's guiding that process. And that's also the self. That's what you could be. And you can communicate in some sense with what you could be.